Hello, my friend. I am glad you found your way back here tonight wherever you are, and whatever kind of day led you to this moment. Come in, get comfortable, and let the rest of the world wait outside the door for a little while. Because tonight we're walking into a place the Romans once called their greatest achievement. Warm marble under bare feet, steam curling toward painted ceilings, perfumed oil glistening on every wall, a city that believed it had finally conquered dirt itself. And yet 2,000 years later, when scientists finally broke open the ground beneath these very baths, they found something that should not have been there at all. Something an entire empire spent centuries quietly trying to hide. Before we step through those doors together, I want to ask you for something small. If this is the kind of story you come looking for at the end of a long day, a tap on that like button, a quiet subscribe, or even a short comment telling me you are here, it helps far more than you might think. It costs you nothing, and it keeps this little corner of the internet alive. And I am curious tonight. Where are you listening from, tucked under a blanket, driving home in the dark, folding the last load of laundry, rocking someone small back to sleep? Tell me in the comments below. I promise I read through everyone. Now go ahead and turn the lights down low. Let a fan hum somewhere behind you, soft and steady, almost like white noise drifting in from another century. Get yourself settled in, because tonight we are going to Rome. Let's call her Amelia. She's not one single woman pulled from the history book. She is every woman who ever lived in that city folded quietly into one. A baker's wife, maybe, or the daughter of a shopkeeper near the Forum. Ordinary, the kind of person history usually forgets to name. It is the middle of the afternoon, and Amelia is walking down a narrow street with her bathing kit tucked under one arm, a small flask of olive oil, a curved bronze scraper, a worn linen cloth. This little bag travels everywhere she does the way a phone might live in your pocket today. Along the way, a boy calls out selling roasted chickpeas from a tray balanced on one shoulder. A cart rattles past loaded with amphorae of wine. Somewhere above her, someone is arguing about the price of bread, and somewhere else a dog is barking at absolutely nothing at all. This is just the ordinary music of a Roman afternoon, the kind of noise you would stop noticing after only a few weeks of living here. She turns a corner and the noise reaches her first. Laughter, splashing, the low hum of hundreds of voices bouncing off marble and painted plaster. Then comes the heat, a wall of warm, damp air rolling out through the entrance, carrying the smell of oil sweat and something floral. Maybe rose water sold by a woman near the door for a few small coins. This is a public bathhouse, and in the city of Rome alone there were hundreds of them. Some small and simple tucked quietly between apartment buildings. Others enormous, built by emperors who wanted their names remembered forever. Palaces of leisure, with gardens, libraries, exercise yards, even stalls selling sausage and honeyed wine. The largest could hold several thousand people at once, all under the same roof, all at the very same hour. Some of these buildings would grow so large that later emperors turned them into monuments to their own names. Enormous complexes big enough to swallow whole city blocks, with soaring ceilings, coloured marble shipped in from distant provinces, and enough space inside for thousands of bathers to move through at once, without ever touching elbows. Grand as they were, though Amelia's neighbourhood bathhouse is a smaller, humbler thing, and honestly that suits her just fine tonight. And here is the part that might actually surprise you. This was not a luxury reserved for the wealthy. A senator and a shoemaker might soak in the very same pool close enough to argue about politics, or trade a little gossip about the neighbours. For the price of one small coin, sometimes less than a loaf of bread, almost anyone could walk through these doors. Historians still point to this as one of the great equalizers of the ancient world, proof they say of a remarkably civilized society. Near the entrance, Amelia spots a familiar face. A neighbour named Flavia, already halfway undressed and waving her over with a kind of easy grin that only comes from years of the same weekly routine. "You are late," Flavia says, not unkindly, already reaching for her own flask of oil. "I saved you a spot near the warm room before the whole street decides to show up." Amelia laughs, tucks a loose strand of hair behind her ear and follows her in. This is not so different, really, from meeting a friend at a favourite coffee shop or waiting for someone by the gym doors. Some habits, it turns out, are simply human, no matter which century you happen to be born into. Inside a bathhouse was never just a place to get clean. It was closer to a town square with steam rising off the floor. In one corner, a group of men played a dice game, arguing loudly over who owed whom a few coins. In another, a woman had her eyebrows plucked by an attendant who worked so quickly it looked almost painless, though the occasional yelp from the bench suggested otherwise. Merchants closed deals over a shared flask of wine. A tired mother watched her children splash each other in the shallow pool, the same tired, fond expression on her face that any mother might wear today, watching her own children do exactly the same thing at a swimming pool 2,000 years later. Amelia, of course, is not thinking about any of that. To her, this is simply an ordinary afternoon. She hands her folded clothes to an attendant near the entrance, hoping they will still be sitting there when she returns. Theft in the changing rooms was common enough that more than one Roman writer complained about it in his letters. Then she moves through the rooms in order the way you or I might move through the stages of a spa day. First, a cold room, a short, sharp shock to wake the skin. Then a warm room where the air feels thick and slow. And finally the hot room where the floor itself is heated from below by a furnace running under the entire building. It is a piece of engineering so clever that pieces of it are still standing today nearly 2,000 years later, quietly outlasting almost everything else the Romans ever built. She does not wash the way we might expect. There is no soap waiting on a shelf, because soap in the form we know it does not exist here yet. Instead, Amelia rubs olive oil across her arms and legs, working it into her skin until it catches the light. Then she picks up that small curved tool, the strigil, and drags it along her arm in one smooth motion, scraping the oil away along with the sweat, the dust, and the grime of the day. It is a strange kind of clean. You do not wash the dirt off. You cover it in oil and then you peel it away layer by layer like paint from an old wall. Picture it for a moment and it is almost funny. Hundreds of people all doing this at once, all shining with oil, all scraping themselves down like statues being polished for a festival. There is a reason Roman writers occasionally joked about the smell of a crowded bathhouse in high summer. Perfume can only do so much work in a room full of steam and bodies. One philosopher named Seneca once wrote to a friend describing the apartment he rented directly above a bathhouse. He complained, half amused and half exhausted, about the grunting of the men lifting weights, the slap of hands on shoulders during a massage, the splashing, the singing, the endless shouting of a man who apparently believed his own voice was more pleasant than anyone else's in the room. Some things, it seems, never really change. A crowded gym still sounds a little like that today. For a few hours, Amelia Soakes talks quietly with the women beside her, listens to children shrieking somewhere in the pool, and maybe closes her eyes and lets the warmth settle into her shoulders. Light drifts down through a small opening in the domed ceiling above, catching the steam and turning it gold for a moment before it drifts apart again. Somewhere nearby, someone hums a few notes of a song, low and unhurried, the kind of sound that makes you want to close your own eyes right along with her. In this moment, it feels like the safest, cleanest place in the entire world. Marble everywhere, heated water everywhere, an entire system built quite literally to wash the empire clean. If you had asked Amelia or almost anyone soaking beside her, they would have told you the same thing without a second thought. This was progress. This was what a great civilization was supposed to look like. This is the image most of us grew up with if we ever thought about it at all. Rome, the birthplace of running water and public sanitation, aqueducts stretching for miles across open countryside, sewers running beneath the streets, long stone toilets with dozens of seats in a row, water flowing steadily underneath, carrying everything quietly away. For a very long time, historians looked at all of this engineering and drew one simple, comfortable conclusion. Surely a civilization this advanced must have been remarkably healthy. But a few years ago, a team of scientists at Cambridge University decided to actually test that comfortable old assumption instead of simply admiring it. They gathered evidence from more than 50 different archaeological sites scattered across the old empire, from windswept forts near the northern edge of Britain, all the way down to the warm shores of the Mediterranean. They went looking underneath the marble. They studied ancient latrines, wooden combs pulled gently from old graves, scraps of preserved cloth, even fossilized human waste that had been sitting quietly in the soil for 2,000 years. It is not glamorous work examining 2,000-year-old waste under a microscope. But unlike marble columns, it does not know how to lie. Going in, the researchers expected a fairly simple story. Before Rome, life was messier, and sickness spread more easily. After Rome arrived with its aqueducts and sewers and heated pools, things should have gradually improved. That was the whole point of all this engineering after all. Clean water in wastewater-out disease pushed quietly to the margins. And what those researchers actually found quietly undid one of history's favourite compliments to itself: whipworm, roundworm, a parasite responsible for severe draining dysentery. These were not fading away as Roman engineering spread further and further across Europe the way anyone might expect. They were increasing. Somehow all of that plumbing, all of that heated water, all of that oil and scraping and rinsing was not making people healthier at all. If anything, in certain places it seemed to be making things worse. Somewhere underneath Amelia's favourite afternoon ritual, something was already quietly going wrong. Not in some obviously filthy back alley, not in a forgotten corner of the slums, but right there in the very water she was soaking in, along with everyone else in that steaming, laughing, sunlit room. Think about what that actually meant for a moment for someone like her. Not a senator with a private bath at home, not an emperor with his own personal spring. An ordinary woman doing exactly what she was told was healthy, exactly what her mother did before her and her mother before that. Dysentery was not some distant abstract word in a medical text. It meant days folded over in pain. It meant a household thrown into worry over a sick child. It meant sometimes a grave that should never have needed digging. And she had no way of knowing that the very place she trusted most, the place built to protect her, may have been quietly working against her the entire time. And that, I think, is where our story really begins tonight. Not with the fall of an empire or a great battle or an emperor drawing his final breath, but with something far smaller and, honestly, far stranger. A quiet, 2,000-year-old mystery hiding in plain sight in the very last place anyone ever thought to look. So just rest here a moment longer, warm and half asleep in the steam beside Amelia and Flavia, listening to the water lap gently against the marble edge of the pool. Because if you listen closely enough, that water has a story of its own to tell. It was never quite as still or quite as clean as it looked from the surface. And in a moment we're going to slip in a little closer and find out exactly what it was hiding underneath. Stay right there for a moment. Do not open your eyes yet. Just feel the warmth of that pool a little longer, the way Amelia does, the way Flavia does beside her. Both of them half floating, half dreaming in water that looks from where they are sitting absolutely perfect. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second. When was the last time you climbed into a hot tub at a hotel and quietly wondered who had been sitting in that exact spot an hour before you? Most of us push that thought away fast because we trust there is a filter running somewhere behind the wall, a chemical doing its job, some invisible system keeping the water honest. Now take that same hot tub and imagine nobody drains it. Not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not for several days. That more or less is the water Amelia is sitting in right now. To understand why, you have to picture how a Roman bathhouse actually worked underneath all that marble. The grandest ones in the city, built by emperors with something to prove, were fed by aqueducts running almost constantly fresh water, pouring in at one end while older water spilled quietly out the other. Engineers were rightly proud of that system. It was in its own way one of the great achievements of the ancient world. Before that water ever reached a pool, though it had already travelled a very long way, sometimes for miles, through channels carved into stone, and closer to the city through pipes made largely of lead. The Romans even took the word for lead plumbum and built an entire profession around it. That word is still sitting inside the job title of the person who fixes your sink today, a small linguistic fossil most of us never think twice about. For a long time, some historians assumed this must have quietly poisoned the population. More recent research paints a slightly gentler picture. Mineral deposits from the water itself often coated the inside of those pipes fairly quickly, forming a kind of natural barrier between the metal and the water flowing through it. So the lead pipes were not necessarily the villain of this story. They were simply one more piece of a very long, very complicated journey, at the end of which the water finally arrived, already carrying whatever minerals, sediment and history it had picked up along the way before a single Roman had even stepped into it. But Amelia is not soaking in one of those grand imperial complexes tonight. She's in a smaller neighbourhood bath, the kind that filled most Roman streets, and those smaller baths could not always afford the luxury of constant flow. Heating water took fuel, and fuel cost money. Somewhere beneath the floor of that hot room, an enslaved worker or a hired labourer was feeding wood into a furnace, hour after hour, keeping the whole building just warm enough to justify the price of admission. Reheating an entire pool from scratch more than once a day would have doubled the cost overnight, and no owner running a small neighbourhood establishment could afford to do that, and still charge a single coin at the door. So many bathhouse owners heated a pool once in the morning, and simply let hundreds of bodies pass through that same water for the rest of the day. Sometimes it was refreshed once every day. In some places, historians believe it may have gone even longer than that between changes. Picture what settles into water like that by mid-afternoon. Oil first, since almost everyone arrives already coated in it. Flakes of skin lifted away by that bronze scraper we talked about earlier. Loose hair, traces of the powders and creams that wealthier bathers like to wear on their faces. All of it drifting, mixing, and slowly forming a thin, pale film across the surface, the kind of film you might not even notice unless the light hit it at exactly the right angle. And bathhouse owners, whether they fully understood what was happening or not, seemed to sense that something needed distracting from. Walk through the ruins of almost any Roman bath today, and you will notice the pools were often lined with deep blue and green mosaic tile, the same colours we still associate with clean, inviting water. That was not an accident. Bright colour on the floor of a pool makes murky water look deliberately tinted rather than simply dirty, a trick modern hotel pools still lean on more than you might expect. On top of that, attendants regularly poured scented oil across the surface of the water, filling the room with the smell of rose or myrrh, thick enough to cover almost anything less pleasant, drifting up from underneath. Between the colour and the perfume, a pool could look and smell like paradise, right up until the moment you actually looked closely at what you were sitting in. A researcher at Cambridge University, the same one whose work we mentioned a little earlier tonight, looked closely at this exact detail when trying to understand why parasites seem to increase rather than decrease during the height of the empire. His theory, when you strip away the academic language, is almost embarrassingly simple. The warm, still water in these communal pools may have been doing more to spread illness than to prevent it. Water that sits and warms and collects a little bit of everyone who steps into it becomes something closer to a shared bowl of soup than a bath. Interestingly, the cold plunge pool sitting just a few steps away told a slightly different story. Because it needed no fuel and no furnace, that icy little pool was often refreshed more easily, sometimes fed by a slow, steady trickle straight from the aqueduct itself. You might assume then that the cold pool was the safer choice. In some ways it was. But cold water also meant bathers spent far less time in it, dipping in for only a few seconds before rushing back out with a gasp, which tells you something rather telling about human nature in any century. We will happily linger in comfort, warmth, and danger together, but we will not linger for a single extra second in something merely safe and unpleasant. Emilia, like most Romans, treats the cold plunge exactly the same way you probably treat a cold shower. Quick, necessary, and over as fast as humanly possible. And I do not say that to be unkind toward the Romans, because here is the thing worth pausing on. They were not careless people. They were not ignorant in the way we sometimes imagine ancient civilizations to be. They built extraordinary systems. They valued cleanliness as a real mark of a good life. And they simply had no way of knowing that something invisible could live in water that looked to every eye in the room completely clear. The word for germ, as we understand it, would not exist for almost 2,000 more years. You cannot fight an enemy you cannot see, and you certainly cannot warn anyone about it either. This is where I think a lot of us get the story wrong when we look back at ancient life. We assume dirty simply meant careless, and clean simply meant safe. But cleanliness to a Roman was almost entirely a visual and social idea. Did your skin shine? Did you smell like oil and flowers instead of sweat and the street? Did you look to your neighbours like someone who belonged in polite company? Nobody was checking for parasites because nobody yet understood that parasites were something a person could check for at all. Now here is a detail that tends to catch people off guard, and I will admit it caught me off guard too the first time I came across it. Historians who study Roman sanitation have pointed out something rather uncomfortable. People did not stay home from the baths simply because they were sick. If you had an open cut or a stomach that would not settle, or a cough that had been sitting in your chest for a week, there was no cultural expectation that you should skip your afternoon soak. Bathing was part of daily life, almost as automatic as eating and skipping it, because you did not feel well was not really how anyone thought about illness at the time. Think, for instance, of a man 2 benches over from Emilia, someone we might call Marcus, a dock worker, who has been coughing since the harvest moon 3 weeks ago. He's not being reckless. He's simply tired and sore from a long day, carrying grain sacks off a ship, and the warm pool is the only relief his body gets all week. Staying home was not really an option either. A day away from the docks meant a day without pay, and nobody was going to explain to him, because nobody yet could, that his cough was drifting invisibly into the same water where children were splashing only a few feet away. So into that same warm pool, along with Emilia and Flavia, and the tired mother and the men arguing over their dice games, stepped people carrying whatever they happened to be carrying that day, visible or otherwise. I want you to sit with that image for just a moment, not to feel disturbed by it, but to feel something a little more interesting, which is empathy. Imagine not knowing. Imagine trusting completely in a system that looked flawless on the surface, because every single thing you had been taught told you it was safe. That is not foolishness. That is simply what it means to live before certain knowledge existed. We do the exact same thing today, somewhere about something. We just do not know which thing yet. That is worth remembering the next time we feel a little too proud of how far we have come. There is also a quieter kind of unfairness tucked into all of this, and it has to do with money the way it so often does. In the grand imperial baths, the ones built for spectacle, wealthier citizens could sometimes enjoy water that moved more freely, simply because those buildings had the funding and the engineering to keep it flowing. Some of the largest complexes even drew from more than one aqueduct at once, giving them enough pressure to keep pools topped up throughout the entire day. In the smaller neighborhood baths, the ones ordinary people actually used most days of their lives, the water sat still for longer, grew warmer, grew murkier, simply because the arithmetic of running a small business never quite allowed for anything better. Clean, in other words, was not distributed evenly across Roman society, even inside a culture that prided itself on offering bathing to everyone regardless of class. The doors were open to all. The water behind those doors was not quite the same experience for everyone who walked through them, and the poorer you were, the more likely you were to be soaking in someone else's afternoon. Doesn't that sound strangely familiar? We still see versions of this today, don't we? In the gap between a resort pool and a crowded public one, in the quality of tap water, depending on which neighborhood you happen to live in who gets the newly renovated gym and who gets the one with the flickering lights, and the pool that always smells faintly of chlorine trying too hard to compensate for something. Some patterns, it seems, are older than we like to admit. None of this stopped Amelia from feeling in that exact moment wonderfully relaxed, and that might be the strangest part of the whole story. Comfort and risk were sitting in the very same pool, completely tangled together, and there was no way back then to separate the two. She leans her head back against the marble edge. Flavia says something that makes her laugh, quietly, eyes still closed. Somewhere across the room, a child is splashing loudly enough that an attendant finally tells him not unkindly to settle down. A shaft of afternoon light moves slowly across the ceiling as the hour passes, and for a little while nothing in the world feels more urgent than staying exactly where she is. Warm water lapping gently against her collarbone, the low murmur of 100 quiet conversations blending into something almost musical. If you had told her in that instant that the very thing cradling her so gently might also be working quietly against her, she would not have believed you. Why would she? It felt like nothing so much as peace. For a while the danger stays exactly where it has always been. Invisible. Patient. Waiting in water that still to this day looks so beautiful in paintings and mosaics that we forget to ask the one question that actually matters. What was really floating in it? It makes me wonder honestly what we might be missing right now in our own daily routines, simply because we do not yet have the instruments to see it. We laugh at the idea of scented oil covering up murky water, and yet most of us have used a scented candle to cover up a smell we did not want to investigate too closely, or trusted a label on a bottle without asking what half the ingredients actually do. 2,000 years is a long time, but human nature when it comes to choosing comfort over inconvenient questions has not shifted nearly as much as we like to think. We're in our own quiet way still lighting candles over things we would rather not smell too closely. Have you ever caught yourself doing exactly that, trusting the surface of something simply because it looked clean enough not to worry about? But water was only the beginning of what these bathhouses were quietly hiding. Because just beyond that warm pool, tucked into a much smaller, much quieter room past a curtain and down a short hallway, where the air turns cooler and a little less perfumed, sat something even stranger than murky bath water. Something the Romans used every single day without a second thought. Something shared by dozens, sometimes hundreds of strangers in a row, resting quietly in a bucket by the wall, as though it were the most ordinary object in the world. And in a way to them it was. So let's leave the pool for a moment, dry off, wrap a linen cloth around bare shoulders, and follow Amelia down that hallway toward a room she visits without even thinking twice about it. Because what is waiting for her in there is about to change the way you think about the phrase sharing is caring for the rest of your life. A curtain moves gently as Amelia pushes past it, and the sound of the pool fades behind her, replaced by something quieter, cooler, almost echoing. This room is smaller than the one they just left, and stranger in a way that has nothing to do with size at all. The air smells faintly of stone and standing water mixed with something sharper, underneath vinegar perhaps, or the salt brine kept nearby for rinsing. A small window near the ceiling lets in a narrow shaft of daylight, just enough to see but not quite enough to make the room feel bright. Along 3 walls run long stone benches carved with a row of neat, evenly spaced openings, each one shaped a little like a keyhole. No stalls, no doors, no dividers of any kind between one opening and the next. Just a continuous bench seat after seat, close enough that your elbow could brush the stranger sitting beside you. Picture that for a second if you can without cringing too hard. A room built for one of the most private acts a human being performs, designed with absolutely no privacy at all. And yet, strangely enough, Romans were not embarrassed by this. Historians who study ancient sanitation have pointed out something rather charming about it, actually. The toga itself did most of the work that a stall door does for us today. Wrapped and draped the way it was, a toga created a kind of soft curtain around the body, even while a person sat in full view of a dozen neighbours. You could be sitting in a crowded room doing something deeply personal, and somehow still feel almost private underneath all that fabric. It is a clever little trick when you think about it, hiding in plain sight by way of good tailoring rather than good architecture. Rooms like this one were not unique to Rome itself either. Archaeologists have uncovered them scattered across the empire, from the busy port city of Ostia to the crowded streets of ancient Ephesus, on the coast of modern-day Turkey, to forts along the edge of Britain where soldiers stationed far from home sat on the very same style of stone bench their commanders would have used back in Italy. Wherever the empire went, this particular design travelled with it, as reliable and predictable as the aqueducts themselves. It is almost touching in a strange way to think of soldiers on a cold, windy frontier thousands of miles from the city of Rome, sitting shoulder to shoulder on a bench that would have felt instantly familiar to anyone back home. Here is a question worth turning over in your mind for a moment. If you had grown up in a culture where this was simply normal, where every single person you knew had used a bench exactly like this one since childhood, would it feel strange to you at all? Or would it just feel like Tuesday the same way a crowded office bathroom feels like Tuesday to us now? Minus, of course, the complete lack of walls. Beneath those stone seats ran a shallow channel water moving steadily along the floor, quietly carrying everything away toward the larger sewer system beneath the city. In front of the benches running along the floor at ankle height sat a second, smaller channel, and this second one is where our story tonight really begins. Because that thin stream of water was not there for washing hands. It had a much stranger purpose. Resting in a bucket near the doorway, sometimes several buckets spaced along the room, sat a simple tool. A stick roughly the length of your forearm with a sea sponge fixed firmly to one end. The Romans called it a tursorium, from a word meaning to wipe clean, and it served, as far as most historians can tell, as their answer to a question every civilization eventually has to solve. What do you use when paper as we know it has not been invented yet and will not exist for well over 1,000 years? The sponge sat soaking in that shallow channel of running water, sometimes mixed with a splash of vinegar or a little salt meant to freshen it slightly between uses. And here is the detail that tends to make people sit up a little straighter under their blankets. That sponge was not personal. It was not tucked into anyone's bathing kit alongside their oil flask and their bronze scraper. It waited there in that bucket for whoever needed it next, rinsed briefly in the channel, and handed along quietly to a room full of strangers hour after hour, day after day. We're not simply guessing about any of this, by the way. In the ruins of a bathhouse along the coast near Rome, a wall painting has survived for nearly 2,000 years, showing exactly this scene, a figure seated on a stone bench, sponge in hand, going about a completely ordinary moment of daily life. It is a small, almost accidental gift from the past, an ancient artist capturing something so mundane that he likely never imagined anyone 2 millennia later would study it so closely, trying to understand exactly how it worked. Now, before we go any further, I want to be fair to the historical record here, because not every scholar agrees on exactly how that sponge was used, and I think the disagreement itself tells a wonderful little story about how history actually gets written. For a long time, it was simply assumed, almost without question, that Romans used this sponge the way you might imagine, for personal cleaning after using the toilet. That assumption made its way into books, documentaries, and more than a few dinner party conversations meant to shock people a little. But a few years ago, an archaeologist who has spent a great deal of time studying Roman plumbing looked more closely at the actual ancient texts that mention this object, writers like Seneca and Martial, and noticed something curious. None of them, when you read the passages carefully, actually describe the sponge being used for personal hygiene in the way we assume. His argument, and it is a fairly compelling one, is that the tersorium may have simply been a toilet brush, used to clean the stone seat itself between visitors rather than a tool anyone pressed against their own skin. I will admit, when I first came across that theory, I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment, which tells you something a little embarrassing about how deep into this research I'd already gone by that point. Relief because a shared toilet brush is a far less alarming image than a shared personal sponge. Disappointment because the shared sponge version had frankly made for a better story. And that, I think, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something true about history in general, not just about ancient toilets. We often want the past to be simple, one tidy fact after another, when in reality most of what we know about people who lived 2,000 years ago comes from scraps, fragments, half-finished letters, and educated guessing dressed up as certainty. The honest answer, more often than we like to admit, is we are not completely sure. And I would rather tell you that plainly than pretend a fuzzy ancient mystery has a clean, confident answer it simply does not have. It also makes me wonder how much of what we confidently believe about our own century will look exactly the same way to someone studying us 2,000 years from now. A future historian sorting through whatever scraps survive of our daily habits, making a reasonable, careful guess about something we never bothered to explain clearly, because to us it was simply too obvious to need explaining. History has a funny way of turning today's common sense into tomorrow's fascinating mystery. Either way, though, whether that sponge touched skin directly or only ever touched stone, the room itself still tells us something worth remembering. Nothing in there was private, personal, or exclusively yours. Not the seat, not the tool resting in the bucket by the door. Not even in the fullest sense the moment itself. A visit to the latrine was like almost everything else in Roman daily life, a shared experience folded quietly into the rhythm of a shared city. Which brings us to something else worth noticing, something that might make you smile despite yourself. Romans did not treat this room the way most of us treat a public restroom today, as a place to get in, get out and make as little eye contact as humanly possible. Latrines were by several accounts places where people lingered. Neighbours caught up on gossip while seated only a few feet apart. Business acquaintances discussed the price of grain. Someone probably complained loudly about their mother-in-law while the person 2 seats down nodded along in polite agreement. It was almost social in its own peculiar way, closer in spirit to a crowded barber shop than to anything we would associate with a bathroom now. Picture an older man near the far wall, someone who has clearly claimed this exact seat as his own, for years greeting each new arrival by name, as though he were hosting them in his own front room. A pair of young men further along argued cheerfully about a chariot race from the week before, each one convinced the other has misremembered the finish entirely. Somewhere someone laughs loud enough that the sound bounces twice off the stone walls before it settles. There is no hush here, no lowered voices, none of the quiet, slightly awkward silence we tend to observe in similar rooms today. It is simply another corner of public life, as unremarkable to the people inside it as a waiting room, and just as full of ordinary human noise. Can you imagine sitting down at your local coffee shop and 2 tables over, someone starts a conversation with you while you're both quite literally using the facilities? It sounds almost absurd from where we stand today, and yet for Amelia, walking in with Flavia still chattering beside her about something one of their neighbours said last week, this is simply how the day unfolds. She takes her seat. Flavia takes the one beside her, and the conversation, without missing a single beat, continues exactly where it left off in the pool room. What almost never continued, unfortunately, was any kind of thorough hand-washing afterward. Near the door of many latrines sat a large clay jar filled with water, and historians studying these rooms have found themselves truly uncertain about how consistently people actually used it. Maybe some dipped their fingers in briefly out of habit. Maybe others walked straight past it without a second thought, already deep in conversation, already thinking about supper. There was no soap waiting there either, remember, and without any understanding that hands themselves could carry invisible danger from one surface to the next. A quick rinse, if it happened at all, was treated more like a polite gesture than a real safeguard. Sit with that picture for a moment, layered on top of everything we've already walked through together tonight. The same warm, murky pool water, the same shared, barely rinsed sponge, hands moving from stone seat to shared bucket to a friend's shoulder, in casual greeting with nothing in between to interrupt whatever was travelling along for the ride. When that team of researchers at Cambridge went looking for the reason whipworm and roundworm seemed to spread more easily as Roman engineering expanded across Europe, this room, this exact combination of habits, sits very close to the centre of the answer. Not because anyone was careless, simply because the pieces fit together so quietly, so invisibly, that nobody in that room had any reason to suspect a thing. Think about how many separate moments had to line up without a single person intending any harm for a parasite to travel from one body to another, inside a place built specifically to promote health. A shared sponge here, an unwashed hand there, a friendly touch on the shoulder meant as nothing more than warmth between neighbours. None of it looks dangerous taken on its own. It is only when you step back the way we're doing together right now that the whole quiet, invisible chain becomes visible at last. It is strange, isn't it, how the most ordinary corners of daily life so often turn out to matter the most. Not the grand battles, not the emperors, not the marble monuments built to be remembered forever, but a modest little room with stone benches and a bucket by the door visited without a second thought by nearly everyone in the empire nearly every single day. Sometimes the biggest turns in history are not loud at all. Sometimes they are sitting quietly in a corner waiting patiently for someone 2,000 years later to finally notice them. If you think about it, we do something similar ourselves without ever noticing. The remote control on your coffee table right now passed between family members without a thought. The pen at the bank counter chained down because someone somewhere decided nobody could be trusted to bring it back. We're not so far removed from that stone bench as we might like to believe. We have simply traded sponges for door handles and buckets for shopping cart bars and told ourselves the trade made us safer. Amelia does not linger long. She finishes exchanges one last comment with Flavia about tonight's dinner plans and rises to head back toward the changing room, ready to dress and step back out into the afternoon sun. But before she leaves that quiet little building behind entirely, there is one more stop worth making, one more part of her routine we have not yet looked at closely tonight. Because everything we have talked about so far, the pool, the sponge, the stone bench, all of it eventually leads back to that small flask of oil tucked into her bathing kit, and to a substance far stranger than any of us have mentioned, yet one that wealthy Roman women were quietly willing to pay a great deal of money for, without necessarily knowing exactly where it came from or exactly whose skin it had come off of first. So let's follow her back out into the light for a moment toward the place where the real transformation happens, where oil meets skin, and skin meets a curved bronze blade, because what gets scraped away in that room does not simply disappear. Somewhere someone is collecting it, bottling it, and selling it one small jar at a time. Out in the courtyard again, the light feels almost blinding after the dim little room they just left. Emilia blinks, adjusts, and finds a quiet corner near a low stone bench, where a few other women are already settled, flasks and scrapers laid out beside them like tools on a workbench. Somewhere nearby, a vendor calls out prices for small clay bottles of scented oil, rose myrtle, something citrus imported from further south, each one promising to make the next hour a little more pleasant than the last. A breeze moves through, carrying the smell of warm stone and crushed olives, and for a moment the whole courtyard feels less like a chore, and more like an unhurried afternoon among friends. This is the part of the visit most people picture first when they imagine a Roman bath, and honestly it deserves a closer look than we gave it earlier tonight, because underneath this simple little ritual sits one of the strangest trade stories the ancient world ever produced. You already know the basics. No soap sitting on a shelf, because nothing resembling modern soap exists yet in this part of the world. Instead, oil. Emilia tips a small stream of it into her palm and begins working it into her skin, starting at her shoulders, moving down her arms the way you might apply lotion after a long hot day. Once her skin is fully coated, she reaches for the strigil, that curved bronze blade, and drags it firmly along her forearm in one smooth stroke, peeling the oil away along with everything it managed to lift off her skin in the process. Here is where most retellings of this story stop satisfied with the image alone, but I want to ask a slightly different question tonight, one that took me down a much stranger road than I expected when I started digging into it. What actually happened to all that oil once it left Emilia's skin? Let's start with where it came from in the first place, because oil itself was never just oil in Rome. It was one of the great engines of the entire economy, grown, pressed, shipped and taxed across an empire that stretched from the hills of modern-day Spain to the coast of North Africa. Entire fleets of ships existed for almost no other purpose than moving amphorae of olive oil from the groves, where it was pressed to the cities, where it would eventually end up on someone's skin, in someone's lamp, or on someone's dinner plate. If you want proof of just how much oil moved through this city, you do not need to take my word for it. You can still walk up a hill near the old river docks in Rome today, an entire hill rising nearly as tall as a 10-story building, made almost completely out of broken clay jars. Millions of them stacked, shattered and buried over centuries, each one once carried on a ship from somewhere far away, emptied of its oil, and simply discarded because it was cheaper to break the jar than to ship it back empty. An entire mountain quietly built out of nothing but the empire's appetite for clean skin and cooking oil. Nobody set out to build a monument there. It happened almost by accident, one broken jar at a time, and yet nothing tells you more clearly just how enormous this trade really was. And just like everything else in Roman life, quality depended heavily on how much money you had. Wealthy households imported oil pressed from the finest early harvest olives, lightly scented, sometimes with rose petals or crushed herbs, expensive enough that a single flask could cost more than a labourer earned in several days. Poorer households made do with oil pressed later in the season, heavier, cruder, sometimes reused more than once before it was finally thrown out. Even the most basic act of getting clean, it turns out, quietly announced your place in society before you'd said a single word. If you had walked into that courtyard 2,000 years ago, a stranger among strangers, someone could likely have guessed roughly how much money sat in your household, simply by the scent trailing behind you as you passed. Rose and imported spice for one family, plain heavier oil for another. Nobody needed to ask. The nose did the sorting long before conversation ever had the chance to. Have you ever noticed how something as ordinary as a bottle of shampoo can do the exact same thing today? Walk down any store aisle, and you will find versions of the same basic product, ranging from a few coins to truly startling sums, promising in one way or another that the expensive version will make you a slightly better version of yourself. 2,000 years apart, and we are still buying the same story, just wearing different labels. Now back to that oil sliding off Amelia's arm in a thin, cloudy ribbon, carrying sweat dust, dead skin, and a full afternoon's worth of ordinary human living along with it. In most households, that mixture simply ran off onto the floor, unremarkable, unwanted, destined for nothing more interesting than a drain. But in certain places across the wider Roman world, particularly around gymnasiums where athletes trained and competed, something rather unexpected happened to it instead. Someone decided it was worth collecting. The Roman writer Pliny, a naturalist with an enormous appetite for cataloguing absolutely everything he could get his hands on, wrote about this practice with something close to disbelief. He seemed almost personally offended by it, actually tucking his account into a much larger complaint about what he saw as Greek excess and vanity, the kind of cultural eye-rolling that has honestly never really gone out of fashion between neighbouring civilizations. According to his account, the managers of certain Greek gymnasiums were in the habit of gathering up the oil scraped from athletes' bodies during training and selling it. Not for a few coins either. Pliny records a sum equivalent to 80,000 sesterces changing hands for this scraped-off residue in a single transaction, an amount that translated into something closer to modern terms would have covered the yearly wages of dozens of ordinary workers. Let that sit with you for a second. Somebody paid a small fortune for a jar of what was essentially other people's sweat oil and dust scraped from their skin after a workout, and Pliny wrote about it specifically because he found the whole idea faintly ridiculous. The substance had a name of its own, gloios in Greek, strigimentum in Latin, and it was not treated as waste at all. It was treated as medicine. Physicians of the era truly believed it held real healing properties, and Pliny lists a startling range of uses across his writings, everything from soothing swollen, aching joints, to treating wounds, to addressing certain women's ailments that were otherwise difficult to manage with the medical tools available at the time. Whether any of it actually worked in the way we would define working today is a separate question entirely, and honestly we will probably never know for certain. But the demand for it was completely real, and so was the money changing hands to acquire it. Somebody, of course, had to do the actual collecting, and it was rarely the wealthy patrons themselves. Attendants and enslaved workers at these gymnasiums were the ones scraping the floors, gathering the residue from walls where sweating athletes had leaned and packaging it for sale, all so that a wealthier customer could later purchase the finished product without ever having to think about where precisely it had come from. It is a pattern that shows up again and again once you start looking for it in Roman life. The unglamorous, physically unpleasant labour sat at the bottom of the social ladder, while the profit and the polished final product floated upward to people who never had to touch the mess itself. Convenience, it seems, has always come with a hidden labour force attached to it, whether that labour force is scraping gymnasium walls in the 1st century or packing boxes in a warehouse today. Here is where the story gets a little tangled, and I think it is worth being honest with you about exactly how tangled it gets. If you have spent any time online, you have probably come across the popular version of this tale, the one where gladiator sweat specifically scraped from famous fighters after a match was bottled up and sold to wealthy Roman women as a kind of beauty serum or even as an aphrodisiac meant to transfer a little of that fighting vitality into the buyer. It is a wonderfully dramatic image, and it shows up constantly in articles, documentaries, and yes, more than a few other storytelling videos very similar to this one. But when historians go back and actually search the surviving ancient texts for solid evidence of that exact version, gladiators specifically sweat, specifically sold to women, specifically as a facial cream, the trail runs surprisingly thin. What Pliny actually documents most clearly involves athletes and wrestlers at gymnasiums, a slightly different world from the blood-soaked arena of gladiatorial combat, and involves treatment of physical ailments as much as, or more than anything, we would recognize as beauty routine. The gladiator version may well contain a kernel of truth buried somewhere in it. Popularity, after all, made all sorts of strange substances desirable across the ancient world, and gladiators were certainly popular, admired, even idolized in ways that occasionally scandalized more conservative Roman writers. It is not hard to imagine that idolization eventually blending in someone's retelling with the older, better documented gymnasium trade, until the two stories quietly merged into one. As it stands today, though, that particular detail sits closer to legend polished smooth by centuries of retelling than to a fact any historian would comfortably stake their reputation on. And I want to pause here for a moment because I think this matters beyond just one dramatic detail about sweat and skin. It would have been easy for me to hand you the more sensational version of this story without checking it closely, because it is without question the more shocking one, and shocking details tend to travel faster and further than careful ones. It would have made for a punchier headline, and I imagine a few of you might have shared it a little more eagerly. But a story does not need to be exaggerated to be worth telling. The version we can actually stand behind wealthy Greeks and Romans paying enormous sums for scraped-off gymnasium grime, believing it held real healing power, is already strange enough to earn its place in tonight's story without any embellishment required. Which raises a question worth sitting with for a moment. How different is this really from what still happens today? Right now, somewhere someone is paying a significant amount of money for a jar of face cream containing snail mucus, or bee venom, or a serum built around something extracted from salmon eggs, convinced that a substance pulled from another living creature holds some transferable power their regular routine simply cannot match. Scroll through any beauty aisle, and you will find ingredients that would have made even Pliny raise an eyebrow, packaged now in sleek glass jars with elegant lettering, instead of a clay pot behind a gymnasium counter. We like to imagine ourselves as having outgrown this kind of thinking, entirely replaced now with clean laboratories and peer-reviewed studies. And to some extent that is true. But the underlying impulse, the belief that something taken from a stronger, more vital body might make our own a little stronger too, has never really left us. We have simply traded gymnasium floors for skincare counters and 80,000 sesterces for whatever a tiny jar costs these days, at a department store usually with a much friendlier salesperson attached. Back in the courtyard, Amelia finishes with her second arm, wipes the strigil clean on a cloth and sets it aside. She has no idea, and honestly no reason to care whether the oil pooling near her feet might eventually be collected by anyone at all. To her, this is simply the unglamorous practical middle step of an afternoon at the baths, sandwiched between the pleasure of the warm pool behind her and the walk home still ahead. She rubs a little more oil into her hands, working it around her knuckles the way you might work in hand cream on a cold morning, and glances toward Flavia, already dressed and waiting with a look that says clearly she is ready for the next stop of the day. Flavia mentions, almost as an afterthought, that she needs to stop by a shop on the way home, something about a payment owed for last week's washing. Amelia groans, only half joking, the way anyone might groan about an unavoidable errand tacked onto an otherwise pleasant afternoon. Neither of them thinks twice about where that errand is about to take them, or what exactly is waiting inside that shop sitting in large ceramic vats along the back wall. There is still no soap in sight, of course, and there will not be not in the way we understand it for a very long time yet. Oil and a blade were the entire technology available for getting clean in this world, along with whatever else people were willing to improvise with when oil alone was not quite enough, and that improvising, it turns out, led the Romans somewhere far stranger than a jar of gymnasium grime. Somewhere involving a substance every single person in that courtyard was producing constantly without a second thought, and without any idea that it was about to become one of the most valuable commodities in the entire city, valuable enough in fact that an emperor would eventually decide it deserved its own tax. So let's step back out onto the street with Amelia and Flavia for a moment, past the vendors, and the noise, past the smell of fresh bread from a stall on the corner, toward a small unassuming shop a few doors down, one that smells nothing at all like roses, and nothing at all like olives either. Because what happens inside that shop is going to make the gymnasium grime we just talked about seem almost pleasant by comparison, and it involves a substance so ordinary, so completely unremarkable to anyone living in Rome at the time that hardly anyone thought to ask why an emperor would eventually want a piece of it for himself. The smell reaches them before the doorway does. Not unpleasant exactly, at least not at first, just sharp, faintly sour, the kind of smell that makes your nose wrinkle on instinct before your mind has caught up to explain why. Flavia does not even flinch. She has clearly made this walk before. Amelia, on the other hand, slows her steps just slightly, the way anyone might slow down approaching a smell they cannot quite place, yet glancing sideways at Flavia, as if to ask whether they have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Inside the shop opens into a wide sunlit courtyard, and the first thing you would notice if you were standing there with them is the row of large stone basins built into the floor, each one deep enough to reach a grown man's knee. Damp wool hangs from wooden racks along the walls, drying in the afternoon sun, and somewhere near the back a woman is folding finished togas into neat, careful stacks, the way you might fold laundry fresh from a dryer today, if that dryer smelled faintly of vinegar and something a good deal less pleasant underneath it. In several of them, workers stand hip-deep in liquid, stomping rhythmically, almost dancing in place, treading fabric beneath their feet, the way you might picture someone crushing grapes for wine. Except this is not wine, not even close. This is a phallonica, a laundry, and what fills those basins is something every single person in the Roman world produced constantly without a second thought, and without ever imagining it might one day become one of the most valuable and most heavily regulated substances in the entire city. Urine. Let that land for a moment, because I want you to really sit with it before we move any further. Roman Empire, so famous for engineering and ambition, that we still study its roads and aqueducts as marvels of human achievement, ran a significant portion of its laundry industry on stale human urine, collected daily, stored in jars and used with real professional skill by workers who understood its chemistry far better than they understood why it worked. Here is the science behind it in the simplest terms I can manage. Urine contains a compound called urea, and given roughly a full day to sit and age, that urea slowly breaks down into ammonia. Ammonia happens to be a remarkably effective cleaner, cutting through grease and body oil, lifting stains and brightening pale fabric in a way that plain water never could. The Romans did not know the word ammonia, obviously, and they certainly did not understand the underlying chemical reaction. What they knew through generations of careful trial and error was simpler and just as useful. This particular liquid left to sit for a day or two made dirty wool clean again, and made white togas look freshly bought instead of a full season old. Here is a strange little thought to carry with you for a moment. If you look underneath your own kitchen sink right now, there is a fair chance you will find a bottle of glass cleaner or all-purpose spray with ammonia listed somewhere on the label, doing more or less the exact same chemical job it was doing in a Roman fuller's basin 2,000 years ago, just packaged now in plastic instead of clay, and marketed with a picture of a sparkling window instead of a toga. So workers filled those basins, added a little fuller's earth, a fine absorbent clay that helped lift out stubborn oil, and then climbed in themselves, treading the mixture through heavy wool fabric with bare feet for hours at a stretch. It was slow work, physically exhausting, and it left an unmistakable smell clinging to a person's clothes and skin long after they had gone home for the evening. The fabric would be rinsed, wrung out by hand, stretched over a domed wicker frame, and then, in one final step that always strikes people as almost theatrical, exposed to the smoke of burning sulphur, which helped bleach the wool a brighter shade of white before it was finally folded and returned to its owner. If you wanted to identify a fuller on the street without asking, you generally did not need to ask. Now, where do you suppose all of that urine actually came from? It did not simply appear in these basins on its own, and the answer to that question leads us to one of my favourite true stories from the entire ancient world, one involving an emperor, his own son, and a single coin held up to a very unimpressed nose. By the middle of the 1st century, public latrines across Rome were, as we already walked through earlier tonight, in constant heavy use. And where there are public latrines, there is inevitably a great deal of urine collecting in one place. Fullers needed a steady, reliable supply of it for their laundry business, and rather than letting it simply drain away into the sewer system unused, they began collecting it directly from public toilets, sometimes paying attendants for access, sometimes gathering it from large jars left specifically for that purpose along the street. An emperor named Vespasian, who inherited a treasury drained nearly dry after years of civil war, looked at this arrangement and saw something most people would have missed entirely: opportunity. He introduced a tax on the collection of urine from public latrines, charging fullers a fee for the privilege of gathering what had, until then, simply been considered waste. It was by any measure an unusual thing to tax, and it is worth remembering that Vespasian did not come from old money or inherited privilege. He rose to power from far more modest beginnings than many of the emperors before him, and perhaps that background made him a little more comfortable than most rulers would have been, looking directly at something unglamorous and asking quite practically whether it could still turn a profit. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, even Vespasian's own son Titus found the whole idea a little embarrassing, unbecoming, he thought, of an emperor's dignity. You can almost picture the scene, a grown son pulling his father aside, lowering his voice, suggesting perhaps this particular tax was beneath the family name. So Vespasian, the story goes, took one of the very first coins collected from this new tax, held it directly under his son's nose, and asked him plainly whether it smelled of anything unpleasant at all. Titus admitted that it did not, and Vespasian, apparently quite satisfied with himself, pointed out that the coin had come quite literally from urine, and yet here it was completely odourless in his hand. Money, he said, does not stink no matter where it came from. That phrase outlived the emperor by roughly 2,000 years. People still say some version of it today, usually without any idea it traces back to a Roman ruler defending a tax on public urinals to his unimpressed son. Isn't it strange how a joke about pee somehow became one of the most enduring lines about economics in the entire Western world? I find something quietly wonderful about that story, honestly, beyond the obvious punchline. It tells you something true about how power actually works then and now. Vespasian was not embarrassed by where the money came from. He was interested in whether it worked, whether it filled the treasury, whether it kept the empire functioning. Somewhere underneath the humour of that exchange with Titus sits a fairly sharp piece of political philosophy, dressed up as a joke about smell, and I think that is exactly why it survived long enough for us to still be talking about it tonight, in a completely different language, on the other side of an ocean nobody in Rome even knew existed. Now here is a detail worth pausing on because it says something about the fullers themselves that might surprise you. Despite the smell, despite the low social standing that came from working with human waste all day, fulling was not a poor person's dead-end job. It was in many cases quite a profitable trade. Fullers organised themselves into guilds, celebrated their own patron goddess, with an annual festival held each spring complete with food, drink and public celebration paid for, out of their own pockets, and some grew wealthy enough to fund public buildings and civic projects, the kind of donations that got a person's name carved into stone for future generations to see. In the city of Pompeii, one particularly successful fuller is remembered by archaeologists specifically because his workshop was large, prosperous, and clearly built to handle a serious volume of business evidence that this smelly, socially awkward trade could still make a person truly comfortable, even respected within his own circle. Walking past a beautifully carved public building in that same city, you might never guess that some of the money behind it came from a trade most polite dinner guests would rather not discuss at the table. Doesn't that pattern sound at least a little familiar? Even today, some of the least glamorous jobs, waste management, sewage treatment, the unglamorous middle layer of any city's infrastructure, quietly generate enormous profit and real expertise, even while carrying a certain social stigma nobody quite manages to shake off. We're happy to enjoy the clean result. We're considerably less eager to think about or thank the person standing in the basin making it happen. Before we leave this particular corner of Roman life, I want to address something you may have already heard, because it comes up constantly whenever this topic gets discussed online, and I think it deserves the same careful treatment. We gave the gladiator story a little earlier tonight. You've probably come across the claim that Romans used urine as a kind of mouthwash, brushing their teeth with it to keep their smiles bright and white. It is a wonderfully shocking detail, the sort of thing that gets repeated in article after article, without much scrutiny, usually presented as a fun fact about ancient Rome as a whole, no caveats attached. But when you actually trace that claim back to its source, the picture gets considerably more specific and a little less universal than the popular version suggests. The detail comes from a Roman poet named Catullus, who wrote a rather cutting little poem mocking a rival, accusing him of copying a habit from a particular tribe in ancient Spain, people the Romans called Celtiberians, said to rinse their mouths and even their teeth with urine each morning. The point of the poem was insult, not admiration. Catullus was mocking what he considered a foreign, faintly barbaric custom, using it specifically because it was unusual and unflattering, not because ordinary Roman citizens were doing the exact same thing in their own homes every morning. Somewhere between that pointed little insult and a modern internet headline, the detail quietly slipped free of its original context and became incorrectly a description of everyday Roman life itself, repeated so often now that it has practically become common knowledge despite resting on a single poem written specifically to mock somebody else entirely. I think that distinction matters, and not just for the sake of being technically correct. It changes the whole flavour of the story, doesn't it? One version paints an entire civilization as universally casually strange. The other version shows us something a little more human and a little more familiar. One culture mocking a neighbouring one for a habit it found distasteful, using exaggeration as a weapon, the exact same way people still do to each other today. We have simply moved that kind of mockery from Latin poetry onto social media, where it travels considerably faster and ironically gets fact-checked considerably less. What we can say with real confidence resting on solid evidence rather than a poet's insult is this: urine truly was collected, taxed and used at a citywide industrial scale for cleaning fabric in Rome. That part is not legend. That part is documented, taxed, celebrated by a guild, and joked about by an emperor to his own son. It does not need embellishment to feel remarkable. The plain, verifiable version of this story is already strange enough to earn its place here tonight. Aemilia waits near the entrance while Flavia counts out a small handful of coins, for the fuller exchanging a few words about a stain that apparently did not come out quite as well as promised last time. The worker in the nearest basin barely looks up, still treading steadily rhythmically through fabric that will by morning be returned to its owner, bright, clean and completely odourless. The smell of the process behind it left entirely in this courtyard, never following the finished cloth home. Outside the street has grown a little busier, vendors calling out the last sales of the afternoon, a group of children chasing something down an alley. The ordinary noise of a city that has no idea how closely historians, archaeologists, and one particular team of scientists will one day study every single detail of its daily routine. It makes you wonder what else in this city built so proudly on the idea of cleanliness was quietly hiding somewhere just out of sight, buried not in a shop like this one but in the ground itself, waiting patiently for someone centuries later to finally go looking for it with the right tools in hand. Because everything we have talked about tonight, the pool, the sponge, the oil, the urine, all of it eventually ends up in the same place. The soil beneath the city, layer after layer, patiently holding on to evidence that no ancient Roman ever imagined anyone would want to examine. So let's leave the fuller's courtyard behind for now, step back out into the afternoon light and follow Aemilia and Flavia home for a little while, because the story does not end with them. Long after the two of them and every other Roman citizen we've talked about tonight were gone, the ground beneath their city kept a quiet, patient record of everything they left behind, waiting layer after layer for scientists with microscopes and a great deal of patience to finally come looking roughly 2,000 years later than anyone in that courtyard would have thought to expect. By the time Aemilia and Flavia part ways near a familiar corner, the light has softened into that particular gold that only shows up in the last hour before evening, the kind that makes even a crowded, dusty street look almost gentle. Aemilia climbs the narrow stairs to her apartment, sets her bathing kit down by the door and settles in for whatever the rest of an ordinary Tuesday still has waiting for her. Dinner, most likely. A little mending. Maybe a short conversation with a neighbour leaning out a window across the alley, trading complaints about the price of bread or the noise from downstairs. Somewhere below a lamp is lit as the light fades further, throwing a small warm circle across a table that has seen thousands of evenings exactly like this one, and we'll see thousands more before this particular building finally falls, centuries from now into the quiet ruin. Future visitors will eventually walk through with cameras and guidebooks in hand. Nothing in this evening feels remarkable to her in any way, and that more than almost anything else we've discussed tonight is exactly the point. She's not living through history. She's simply living the way any of us are simply living right now, without the faintest idea which small, unremarkable detail of today might matter to someone studying us 2,000 years from this very moment. Let's leave her there for the evening, safe and warm, and completely unaware of everything we already know about the pool she soaked in, and travel forward instead past centuries of emperors and invasions, and rebuilding all the way to a research laboratory that would have looked to Amelia like something out of a nightmare or a myth. Bright lights, silent machines, people in white coats hunched over instruments so precise they can find something invisible to the naked eye buried in soil that has not been disturbed in nearly 2,000 years. Because remember what we talked about right at the very beginning of tonight's story. A team of researchers at Cambridge University set out to answer a fairly simple question. Did Roman engineering all those aqueducts, sewers and heated pools actually make people healthier? And to answer it properly, they could not simply admire the architecture from a distance. They had to get their hands dirty, quite literally digging through old latrines, examining human burials, and studying something most of us would rather not think about too closely. Fossilized feces preserved in the soil for 2,000 years, patiently waiting to tell its own version of the story. There is a proper word for it, by the way, if you want to sound impressively informed at your next dinner party. Coprolite. It sounds almost elegant, doesn't it? Dressed up in enough Latin and Greek to make it sound like something you might find in a museum display case rather than exactly what it actually is. And in fact, you can find it in museum display cases carefully labelled sitting behind glass, treated with the same seriousness as a piece of pottery or a coin, because to the right kind of scientist it holds exactly that much information. Picture the actual process for a moment, because it is a good deal less glamorous than the word coprolite might suggest. A researcher, gloved and patient, carefully breaking apart a small ancient sample under bright laboratory light, suspending fragments of it in liquid, straining that liquid through increasingly fine filters, and finally placing a single drop under a microscope lens, searching for something almost impossibly small. It is not the kind of scene that ends up in an adventure film. There is no dramatic music, no sudden gasp of discovery. Just quiet, careful, repetitive work day after day, across dozens of samples until a pattern slowly, patiently begins to emerge from the noise. Here is what they were looking for specifically. Tiny durable eggs left behind by intestinal parasites, whipworm and roundworm, among them creatures so small you would need a microscope to see even one, yet common enough, apparently that entire populations carried them without ever fully realizing it. These eggs are remarkably stubborn things. Long after the person who carried them has been gone for 2 millennia, the eggs themselves can remain intact in the right conditions, tucked into damp soil, latrine sediment, or the fibres of an old comb pulled from a grave. And what those eggs revealed once researchers started counting them across dozens of different archaeological sites scattered from the edges of Britain down to the shores of the Mediterranean was not the story anyone expected walking in. Before Rome expanded across a region, rates of these parasites tended to sit at one level, shaped by whatever local sanitation practices already existed, imperfect as they often were. After Roman infrastructure arrived, aqueducts, sewers, heated public baths, all of it. The expected outcome should have been a steady decline. Cleaner water in waste pushed further away, fewer parasites completing their life cycle inside a human host. That is how modern public health works, and reasonably, That is what everyone assumed ancient public health should have looked like too, especially given how confidently later generations praised Roman engineering as the gold standard the rest of the world would spend centuries trying to catch up to. Instead, the numbers went the other way. Slowly but unmistakably, whipworm and roundworm became more common, not less, as Roman influence spread further across the map. Somewhere in that beautiful engineered system of clean water and communal comfort, something was quietly working against its own purpose, and for years nobody could say with certainty exactly what. Can I be honest with you about something? When I first read through the details of this research, my first reaction was almost defensive on behalf of the Romans, which is a strange thing to feel protective over people who've been gone for 2,000 years, I realise. I wanted there to be some simple mistake in the data, some explanation that would let their reputation stay intact, the same way you might feel a small flash of loyalty toward a favourite historical figure when a new biography reveals something less flattering than the version you grew up believing. But the more I sat with it, the more I realised that defending an image is not really the same thing as respecting the truth. And honestly, the truth here is more interesting anyway. It is not a story about a civilization failing. It is a story about how easily even brilliant engineering can be quietly undone by a handful of habits nobody thought to question, because nobody yet had the tools to see what those habits were actually doing. Now here is a detail from this same body of research that I have been saving for tonight specifically because it deserves a little space of its own. Alongside whipworm and roundworm researchers found something they did not initially expect at all. Fish tapeworm eggs, and not just in coastal regions where fish was an obvious dietary staple, but scattered across areas of northern Europe, where this particular parasite had no business appearing at anywhere near that frequency, based on the local diet and climate alone. The explanation, once researchers pieced it together, connects directly back to something we've not talked about yet tonight, a beloved Roman condiment called garum. If you can picture something like a distant, much more intense cousin of modern fish sauce, you're on the right track. Garum was made by packing fish sometimes, whole small fish, sometimes just their innards, into large vats with salt, and leaving the entire mixture to sit and ferment under the open sun for weeks at a time. Entire workshops along the coast existed for almost no other purpose, rows of stone vats built specifically for this one product, filling the air around them with a smell strong enough that Roman writers occasionally joked about needing to hold your breath while walking past a garum factory. The result was an intensely flavoured liquid, salty savoury, almost addictive by most accounts, and Romans drizzled it over everything: meat, vegetables, bread, the way you or I might reach for a bottle of soy sauce or hot sauce without thinking twice. Wealthy households paid handsomely for the finest grades, aged carefully, and prized almost like a fine wine, while cheaper, rougher versions found their way onto the tables of ordinary families like Amelia's. The trouble is that long warm fermentation process, however effective it was at building flavour, did nothing at all to kill parasite eggs hiding inside the fish. And because garum was traded and shipped across the entire empire, carried in sealed jars from production centres along the coast to households hundreds of miles inland, it carried those parasites with it tucked invisibly inside a condiment. Nobody would have thought twice about pouring generously over their dinner. Isn't that a strange thought to sit with for a moment? An entire empire connected by roads and ships, and a shared taste for one particular sauce, and that exact same connectivity, the very thing that made Rome feel so impressively unified and advanced, became the perfect delivery system for something nobody could see coming. Convenience and contamination travelling together in the very same jar. I want to bring you one more piece of this puzzle, because it involves a level of scientific detective work that truly impressed me when I first came across it, and I think it deserves a moment of real appreciation. Along the northern edge of the old empire, near a stretch of wall the Romans built to mark the border of Britain, archaeologists excavated the drain of an old bathhouse attached to a military fort. It is a remarkably well-preserved site, the kind that has already given historians thousands of small wooden writing tablets, letters, requests, birthday invitations, the everyday paperwork of soldiers stationed about as far from the comforts of Italy as the empire reached. Soldiers stationed there far from the warmth of Rome would have used this exact bathhouse, the same way Amelia used hers earlier tonight without a second thought, simply part of daily military life on a cold, windswept frontier, the wind cutting differently here than it ever did back home. Researchers collected dozens of sediment samples from that drain, nearly 60 in total, and went looking not just for the sturdy, durable parasite eggs that tend to survive well over time, but for something far more elusive, a parasite responsible for a severe form of dysentery, one that, unlike whipworm or roundworm, does not leave behind a hard protective eggshell that can simply sit in soil for 2,000 years waiting to be found. To detect it, scientists had to use a technique that searches for leftover proteins. The organism leaves behind something closer to the kind of testing you might associate with modern medical diagnostics than with archaeology at all, and they found it. Evidence of that same severe draining illness sitting quietly in the drain of a bathhouse built specifically to keep soldiers clean and healthy on a hostile frontier thousands of miles from the city of Rome itself. It is one thing to imagine this pattern playing out in a crowded civilian bathhouse full of ordinary families. It is another thing entirely to realize it reached all the way to a remote military outpost, following the empire's own engineering wherever that engineering happened to go. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, one I keep coming back to myself. If an army built specifically for discipline, order, and careful planning still could not outrun this problem, what does that tell us about how deeply woven into daily life these habits really were? It was not carelessness in any single moment. It was 1,000 small, perfectly reasonable choices made by perfectly reasonable people, adding up quietly over generations into something nobody could have predicted and nobody at the time had any real way of stopping. I think this is the part of the story that stays with me longest, honestly, more than any single gross detail we've covered tonight. It is not really a story about ancient people being dirty or careless. It is a story about how invisible risk moves through a society completely undetected, hiding inside the very systems built to prevent it, whether that system is a bathhouse in the 1st century or something far closer to our own lives today. We like to believe that progress once achieved simply keeps moving in one direction, each generation a little safer, a little cleaner, a little wiser than the one before it. Rome quietly reminds us that progress can build something remarkable and still leave a door open somewhere without anyone noticing exactly where. Have you ever built something in your own life that you were certain had solved a problem completely, only to discover much later that it had simply hidden the problem somewhere new? A budget that looked perfectly balanced until an unexpected expense revealed the gap you had not accounted for. A schedule that felt airtight until one small delay unraveled the whole week. Systems fail quietly far more often than they fail loudly, and Rome, for all its marble and ambition, was no exception to that rule. But here is the thing that truly puzzles me, and I suspect it might be sitting in your mind too by now. If all of this was happening so consistently, spreading through pools, sponges, sources and drains, all across the empire, surely somebody at the time must have noticed a pattern. Surely a doctor somewhere treating patient after patient with the exact same stubborn stomach troubles must have started asking questions of his own even without the word germ anywhere in his vocabulary, and as it turns out, someone did notice. Several someones actually writing down their observations in careful detail centuries before anyone could explain exactly what they were witnessing. So let's turn our attention there next to the doctors themselves standing at patients' bedsides with nothing but their own careful eyes and centuries of accumulated guesswork trying to make sense of an enemy they could feel the effects of long before they ever had a name for it. Picture a young physician still in his 20s standing in a dim stone room in the city of Pergamon, a city on the coast of what is now Turkey, sleeves pushed up, hands already stained, staring down at a wound most doctors of his era would have simply called hopeless. Torchlight flickers against the walls. Somewhere outside, the roar of a crowd still lingers faintly in the air, the game's not quite finished for the day. A gladiator lies before him, sliced open across the abdomen, and everyone in the room, including the wounded man himself, more or less expects this to be the end of the story. The young doctor's name was Galen, and this was not technically his first choice of career. He would have much preferred a quiet life devoted to philosophy and careful argument, but his father, an architect with strong opinions about practical professions, insisted on medicine instead after apparently receiving a dream instructing him to do so. However Galen actually ended up in that room, what he did next would end up shaping medical thinking for the next 1400 years, which is by any measure an almost absurd amount of influence for one person to hold on to for that long. The high priest overseeing the local games had recently watched several gladiators die from wounds that in Galen's professional opinion should have been survivable. So he made an unusual decision. He hired this young, largely unproven physician to take over care of his fighters, and Galen, over the 4 years that followed, quietly turned that gruesome blood-soaked position into one of the most important medical apprenticeships in the ancient world. Here is why this mattered so much, and why I wanted to bring it into tonight's story specifically. Human dissection was forbidden across most of the Roman world at the time, tangled up in deep cultural and religious discomfort around disturbing the dead. Physicians were expected to understand the human body without ever really being permitted to look directly inside a living one. Gladiatorial wounds, horrifying as they were, quietly broke that rule wide open. A sword slicing through muscle or a spear opening the abdomen handed Galen something almost nobody else in his profession had legal access to. A living window into the body, muscle, tendon and organ laid bare in front of him, still functioning, still failing, still teaching him something new with every single injury that came through his door. And what Galen noticed, treating wound after wound, week after week, went well beyond anatomy alone. He came to think of each wound almost affectionately, if that is not too strange a word to use here, referring to them in his own writing as windows into the body, small, terrible openings that let him see however briefly what lay hidden beneath skin that usually kept its secrets close. A torn muscle taught him something about movement. An open chest tragically taught him something about breath. He began developing his own treatment methods based purely on what seemed to work in front of him, regardless of whether he understood exactly why it worked. For deep wounds to the arms and legs, he favoured dressings soaked in wine, layered with damp sponges, kept consistently moist, rather than left to dry out completely. He had no concept of bacteria, obviously no framework for understanding infection, the way we would explain it today, but he had something almost as valuable in its own way: careful repeated observation, and the humility to notice which patients survived and which did not, and to ask why. We know now, looking back with the benefit of modern chemistry, that wine carries a meaningful amount of alcohol, along with a certain natural acidity, both of which happen to slow the growth of many harmful microorganisms. Galen could not have explained any of that to you. He simply knew through trial error and an unusually disciplined memory for outcomes that wine-soaked dressings seemed to keep his patients alive more often than the alternatives his colleagues were using. By his own account, and take this with the understanding that ancient authors were not always shy about polishing their own reputations, the death rate among the gladiators under his care dropped dramatically compared to the years before he arrived. Isn't that a remarkable thought to sit with for a moment? A man stumbling towards something remarkably effective centuries before anyone could explain the actual science behind it, simply because he refused to stop paying close attention. How many of us faced with something that clearly worked, but that we could not fully explain, would have the patience to keep using it anyway, trusting the pattern over the missing theory? Now let's step away from the arena for a moment back toward the world we've spent most of tonight exploring, and toward a very different kind of Roman medical writer. His name was Celsus, and unlike Galen, he was likely never a practicing physician himself, in the strictest sense. He was something closer to a scholar and compiler, a wealthy, well-educated man, with a taste for organizing knowledge, gathering the accumulated medical wisdom of his time into an enormous encyclopedia that also covered farming law, warfare and rhetoric, only a portion of which survives today focused specifically on medicine. That surviving portion sat largely forgotten for well over 1,000 years, until a curious pope rediscovered it centuries later and had it printed, making it one of the very first medical texts ever put through a printing press. And tucked inside that surviving portion sits a piece of advice that connects directly, almost eerily, back to everything we have spent tonight walking through together. Celsus warned against bathing while a wound was still fresh. Sit with that for a second, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. He believed correctly, as it turns out, even without any concept of bacteria, that moisture and dirt introduced into an open wound could encourage the kind of dangerous spreading infection the Romans called gangrene. His solution was not complicated. Keep the wound away from water, particularly the warm, crowded communal water, sitting in a public bath until healing had properly begun. He also recommended, when a limb had already progressed too far into that kind of decay, that a surgeon amputate cleanly above the damaged tissue, rather than waiting and hoping a piece of advice grounded in exactly the same careful outcome-based thinking Galen was using a world away in Pergamon. Neither man had a microscope. Neither man had a word for infection in the way we use it now. But both of them had learned through repetition and consequence roughly where the danger tended to live. Think about what that actually implies layered on top of everything we've already discussed tonight. A respected Roman medical authority writing during the very same centuries Amelia and thousands like her were soaking in those pools every single afternoon was quietly warning his readers that bath water and open wounds did not mix well together. He did not know about parasites. He did not know about bacteria multiplying in warm, still water. But he had noticed through pattern and consequence that something about that combination tended to go badly often enough, that it was worth writing down and passing along. Here is a question worth turning over in your mind for a moment. If a warning like that existed in writing available to anyone literate enough to read it, why didn't it change daily life more dramatically? Why did people keep bathing with cuts, scrapes, and lingering illness the way we talked about a few segments ago tonight? I think the honest answer says something true about human nature in any century, not just this one. Knowing a risk exists in the abstract and actually reorganizing your daily habits around that risk are two very different things. We do this today, constantly know something is probably not great for us, and continue doing it anyway, because the habit is comfortable, the community is familiar, and the danger feels distant, invisible. easy to postpone worrying about until tomorrow never quite arrives. It helps to understand too the theory most of these physicians were actually working from, because it explains why their conclusions sometimes landed remarkably close to correct and other times missed by a wide margin. Roman and Greek medicine largely operated on the idea that the body was governed by 4 internal fluids, often translated as blood, phlegm, and 2 forms of bile, and that health depended on keeping these 4 fluids in careful balance. Too much of one, too little of another, and illness followed. Bathing diet, bloodletting, even a person's general mood, all of it was filtered through this framework. It was by modern standards entirely wrong as an explanation. And yet because it encouraged careful observation of symptoms, diet, and daily habit, it occasionally led physicians toward truly useful conclusions. Anyway, the way a wrong map can still by coincidence point you toward a real landmark. Celsus was not always right, of course, and I think it is worth being honest about that too, the same way we have tried to stay honest with each other through every part of tonight's story. Tucked into his same writings alongside truly useful advice about cleaning wounds with vinegar and a certain fragrant oil, both of which really do carry mild antiseptic properties, we can confirm. Today sit remedies that have not aged nearly as well. He records sometimes with a note of clear skepticism the belief that drinking the blood of a defeated gladiator could cure epilepsy, or that eating snakes might help clear up a stubborn abscess. Ancient medicine, it turns out, was rarely one single coherent system. It was a tangled, evolving mixture of careful observation, sitting right alongside inherited superstition, sometimes on the very same page written by the very same hand. And honestly, I find that mixture more interesting than a clean, tidy version of the story would have been. It would be easy to imagine ancient physicians as either brilliant precursors to modern medicine or hopeless, superstitious fools stumbling around in the dark. Neither picture is quite true. They were something more human than either extreme, reasonably intelligent people, doing remarkably careful work with painfully incomplete tools, right alongside beliefs that simply had not yet been tested and discarded. Not every Roman physician agreed on how baths fit into all of this either, which I think is worth mentioning because it shows you medicine was never one unified voice speaking with the single opinion. A physician named Asclepiades working in Rome slightly before Celsus wrote, his encyclopedia believed almost the opposite when it came to general health. He championed baths warm and cold, both as real tools for healing alongside music wine and gentle massage favouring treatments that avoided causing his patients unnecessary pain. To him, the very same warm water that concerned Celsus around fresh wounds was in ordinary circumstances part of the cure rather than the danger. 2 respected medical voices working in the very same city, reaching 2 different situational conclusions about the very same water, each one supported by whatever pattern of outcomes he had personally observed. That tension, I think, is really the heart of tonight's story. Not simple ignorance and not hidden secret knowledge either, but a group of intelligent, careful people working with observation instead of explanation, occasionally getting remarkably close to the truth, and occasionally missing it by a wide margin without any reliable way to tell in the moment which was which. If you had asked Amelia about any of this back in that warm pool earlier tonight, she likely would not have known Celsus's name or Galen's either. Medical writing like this circulated mainly among the educated and the wealthy, copied by hand, expensive to own, read aloud in small circles rather than distributed the way information travels now. A farmer, a fuller, a woman soaking beside her friend on an ordinary afternoon, none of them were likely to ever hold a copy of that encyclopedia, let alone read the specific passage warning against bathing with an open wound. Ordinary daily habits changed slowly if they changed at all, regardless of what the most careful minds of the era had already quietly figured out and written down. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much accurate, truly useful knowledge exists somewhere in our own world right now, sitting in a journal or a report true and well documented, simply waiting for ordinary daily habits to eventually catch up to it, the same slow, uneven way they eventually caught up centuries later here. We like to imagine information travels instantly now, and in some sense it does. But knowing something, and actually living differently because of it, remain two very separate journeys, exactly the way they were in Pergamon, exactly the way they were in Rome. But bathing was not only a medical question in ancient Rome. It was also, as it turns out, a deeply social one tangled up with questions of modesty, propriety, and who exactly was allowed to share that warm water with whom. And that particular argument, unlike most of what we've discussed tonight, was loud, public, and occasionally involved an emperor stepping in directly to settle it. So let's step back out of the physician's study for a moment and into a much more crowded, much more contested corner of Roman life, where the question was no longer simply what the water might be carrying, but who was permitted to be sitting in it at the very same time, and what happened to a woman's reputation if she got that particular answer wrong. Let's go back a little further than Amelia's afternoon for a moment, back a full century or more, to a version of Rome that would have looked, in some ways, strangely more conservative than the one we've been walking through together tonight. In the earlier centuries of the Republic, bathhouses generally kept men and women apart, either through entirely separate wings of the same building, or simply by opening at different hours of the day. A woman bathed in the morning, perhaps escorted by a servant or a female relative, moving through the rooms in a quieter, less crowded version of the ritual. We've already watched Amelia go through tonight, and men filled the same rooms once she'd gone home, the whole building resetting itself socially at least twice a day. It was tidy, predictable, and largely uncontroversial, the kind of arrangement nobody bothered writing angry letters about because nobody felt any particular need to. By the time we reach the world Amelia actually lives in, though something had shifted, and it had shifted rather significantly. Mixed bathing men and women soaking in the very same pool at the very same hour had quietly become common enough that Roman writers of the period barely blinked at mentioning it. Poets like Martial and Juvenal referenced it casually in their work, the way a modern writer might mention people at a crowded gym without needing to explain the concept of a gym to the reader. It was simply part of the texture of daily life, at least in certain baths at certain times in certain cities. Here is a detail worth sitting with for a moment because I think it says something honest about how change actually happens in a society. Nobody passed a single dramatic law declaring mixed bathing suddenly acceptable. It appears to have crept in gradually, bathhouse by bathhouse, city by city popularity, quietly outpacing whatever formal rules existed on paper until eventually the informal reality and the official expectation no longer matched each other at all. That is usually how these shifts actually happen, isn't it, in any century? Not a single dramatic announcement, but 1,000 small, unremarkable choices, each one barely noticed on its own, adding up over years into a completely different world than the one everyone still assumes they are living in. And that mismatch predictably made a certain kind of person very uncomfortable. By the early 2nd century, complaints about mixed bathing had grown loud enough and frequent enough that an emperor finally felt compelled to step in directly. His name was Hadrian, a ruler more often remembered today for the enormous wall he built across northern Britain, a wall we actually mentioned briefly a little earlier tonight, without knowing yet how much more of him we would run into before the evening was through, and for the sprawling bathhouses and mausoleum he left behind in the city of Rome itself. According to surviving records, Hadrian issued an order separating men and women in the baths, once again restoring something closer to the old republican arrangement, assigning different hours to each so that the two groups would no longer share the water at the very same moment. Now I want to pause here and be honest with you about something the same way we have tried to stay honest through every part of tonight's story. The specific ancient source describing Hadrian's decree is not by modern historical standards a perfectly reliable one. It comes from a much later collection of imperial biographies written centuries after Hadrian's own lifetime, a collection scholars today treat with real caution, since it mixes verified fact with material that looks suspiciously like invention or exaggeration. So while historians generally accept that some kind of separation was attempted under Hadrian, the exact wording and even some of the finer details rest on a source we cannot fully trust at face value. What we can trust, though, is the pattern that followed. Because Hadrian's order, whatever its precise original form, clearly did not settle the matter permanently. Decades later, another emperor, Marcus Aurelius, a man remembered by history as thoughtful, disciplined, and largely uninterested in frivolous pleasures, felt the need to issue a similar order of his own. And decades after that, yet another emperor, Severus Alexander, did the exact same thing again. 3 separate rulers across roughly a full century, each one apparently convinced he had finally solved a problem that kept quietly reappearing almost as soon as the ink had dried, the way a stubborn weed keeps pushing back up through the same crack in the pavement no matter how many times you pull it out. Doesn't that tell you almost everything you need to know about how effective these decrees actually were? You do not need to reissue a rule 3 times across 100 years if the first version actually worked. People, it turns out, went right on bathing together, regardless of what any emperor's decree happened to say. The same way people today ignore all sorts of official guidance the moment it becomes inconvenient or simply easy enough to overlook whether that guidance concerns a posted speed limit or a workplace policy nobody has enforced in years. I find something quietly funny about that, honestly layered underneath the more serious social questions involved. An emperor commanding an entire empire capable of building walls across whole countries and cities that still stand 2,000 years later, apparently could not fully convince his own citizens to bathe on a schedule. Some things, it seems, sit stubbornly outside the reach of even the most powerful person's authority and human habit. Especially a pleasant one tends to be one of them. You can conquer a continent apparently a good deal more easily than you can convince a crowded bathhouse to check the clock before stepping into the water. Now here is where the story gets a little more complicated and where I think it becomes truly relevant to how we understand women's lives in this period specifically. A popular assumption took hold both among some ancient Roman moralists and later among modern historians reading them that only certain kinds of women mixed bathed with men. Women of lower status, the thinking went, or women whose reputations were already considered questionable entertainers, or those working in less respectable trades. Respectable women in this version of the story supposedly avoided mixed baths entirely, protecting their reputations by staying within all female spaces. But when historians actually dig into the surviving evidence more carefully, that tidy division starts to fall apart. A Christian writer named Clement of Alexandria, observing Roman bathing culture from the outside with a fairly critical eye, someone who it is worth noting had every reason to want to paint pagan Roman customs in an unflattering light, specifically noted that women from the very highest levels of society were bathing alongside men, not just those on the margins of respectability. He was not praising the practice, understand. He was criticizing it disapprovingly, listing it among the excesses of Roman life he found troubling. But even in his disapproval, his testimony tells us something valuable, because a critic writing to condemn a behavior generally has little reason to exaggerate exactly who was participating in it. Wealth and status, it turns out, did not automatically keep a woman out of that shared water. If anything, some of the most privileged women in the empire were also among the most visible participants in exactly the practice moralists claimed only lower status women engaged in. There is also a rather specific case worth mentioning here because I think it shows how easily a mistaken assumption can slip quietly into the historical record and simply stay there for generations. A 20th century historian writing about Roman baths read a passage from the Roman educator Quintilian and concluded that Quintilian must have been referring to prostitutes when he mentioned women present at the baths. It was by most accounts a fairly confident leap from a passage that never actually used that word or anything close to it, but the interpretation was written with enough authority that later writers simply borrowed it, footnote after footnote, without necessarily going back to check the original Latin themselves. That interpretation then found its way into later books, repeated with growing confidence each time until it started to feel like settled fact rather than one scholar's educated guess. More recent historians, going back to Quintilian's original words rather than relying on second-hand summaries, have pushed back fairly firmly on that reading, arguing there simply is not enough in the original text to support such a specific and reputation-damaging conclusion. I think that example matters beyond just correcting one small academic mistake. It shows you how easily a single interpretation, especially one that happens to fit a convenient, tidy narrative about respectable versus disreputable women, can calcify into accepted fact over time simply because it gets repeated often enough by confident-sounding voices. Doesn't that sound uncomfortably familiar in a completely different context? How many assumptions about women in any century get treated as fact mainly because they were stated firmly and repeated often, rather than because the original evidence actually supported them? Picture for a moment what this actually meant for someone like Amelia, navigating her own choices about where and when to bathe. She was not making a purely private decision about hygiene and relaxation. She was whether she thought about it consciously, or not making a small social calculation every single time she chose which bathhouse to visit and at which hour. A neighbourhood bath known mainly for families and quiet familiar faces like the one we followed her into earlier tonight carried a different social weight than a grander, more fashionable therme known for drawing a livelier, more mixed crowd. Some establishments earned reputations, fair or not, for exactly the kind of behaviour the moralists loved to complain about, and a woman choosing to walk through those particular doors on those particular hours was making a statement whether she intended one or not. Reputation in Rome travelled fast, carried along by exactly the kind of gossip we imagined Flavia and Amelia trading earlier this evening, and a woman's choices, even something as ordinary as an afternoon bath, could quietly become part of that conversation, whether she wanted them to or not. A neighbour mentioning almost in passing which bath a particular woman had been seen leaving, and at what hour, could shape opinion far more effectively than any formal accusation ever could. There was no need for a scandal to actually happen. The mere possibility of one whispered convincingly enough often did nearly as much damage. Can you imagine carrying that kind of quiet, constant calculation into something as simple as choosing when to relax? We still do versions of this today, don't we? Weighing which gym to join based on its particular crowd and reputation, which neighbourhood pool feels comfortable, and which one does not, adjusting our own routines around social perception in ways we rarely stop to name out loud. The specific rules have changed enormously across 2,000 years. The underlying pattern, a woman quietly managing her own reputation through small everyday choices about where her body is seen, and by whom, has proven considerably more stubborn than any of us might like to admit. None of this, I should say, clearly means the mixed baths were some den of scandal every single afternoon, despite how eagerly a few Roman poets like to write about them that way for comic or provocative effect. For most people, most of the time, it was simply an ordinary part of daily life, families and neighbours and friends sharing warm water together, the same way people share a crowded beach or a busy public park today, without any particular scandal attached to the moment at all. Children splashed. Old friends caught up on news. Someone's grandmother probably scolded a young man for splashing too enthusiastically near the edge, the same way a grandmother might do exactly that today, in any pool, in any country, in any century. The moralists complaining loudest about it were often writing for dramatic effect, exaggerating for the sake of a sharper line of poetry, or a more entertaining bit of social commentary, the ancient equivalent of a columnist stretching a story for clicks, aware that outrage, even mild outrage, tends to sell better than a calm description of an unremarkable afternoon. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of what survives from any era is really an accurate snapshot of daily life, and how much of it is simply whichever complaint happened to be written down loudly enough by someone with an audience to survive 2,000 years while quieter, more ordinary experiences quietly disappeared. The people having a perfectly pleasant, unremarkable afternoon rarely bother writing an angry poem about it afterward. Only the offended ones tend to reach for a pen, which means our entire picture of the past is quietly skewed just a little toward complaint over contentment. If future historians judged our own century purely by whichever post generated the loudest reaction online, I suspect they would come away with an equally distorted picture of how most of us actually spent our ordinary afternoons. There is one more corner of this world we've not yet stepped into tonight, and it might be the most surprising one of all, because it has nothing to do with water or oil or even reputation. It has to do with the people working quietly behind the scenes of every single bathhouse we have visited together this evening. The ones scrubbing floors, gathering combs, sweeping hair from tile, whose own daily lives tell us something about Roman society that the marble columns and painted ceilings were never designed to reveal. So let's step away from the pool one more time and follow the story into the narrower, less glamorous corridors of the bathhouse, where the real unglamorous labour of keeping this whole beautiful system running actually happened. Every beautiful room we have walked through together tonight, the warm pool, the sunlit courtyard, the quiet latrine with its running water, was in a very real sense a kind of performance. Marble does not stay polished on its own. Furnaces do not feed themselves. Someone somewhere just out of view was working constantly to make sure that performance never stopped, never faltered, never revealed the effort humming away just beneath its surface. We have spent this whole evening admiring the stage, the water, the light, the ritual without once glancing toward the wings, where the actual machinery of the whole production was quietly, tirelessly at work. Tonight, let's finally pull back the curtain on that part of the story, because I think it deserves at least as much attention as the pool itself. Start with the heat. Every single one of those warm rooms Amelia moved through this afternoon. The tepid room, the steaming hot room stayed warm because of a furnace burning somewhere beneath the floor, feeding hot air through a network of narrow channels built directly into the walls and floor itself, an ingenious system that let heat rise gently up through solid stone, rather than relying on an open flame anywhere near the bathers. It was honestly brilliant engineering. But brilliant engineering still needs fuel, and fuel does not load itself. Somewhere below Amelia's feet in a cramped, sweltering space she likely never saw, and probably never once thought about a worker-fed wood into that furnace. Hour after hour, all day, every day, the bathhouse remained open. The heat down there was punishing, thick with smoke. Nothing like the clean, gentle warmth drifting up through the floor above. There was no window down there to let the smoke clear, no gentle breeze, no painted ceiling to rest your eyes on between shovelfuls. Just heat ash and the steady, repetitive work of keeping a fire fed exactly hot enough hour after hour to satisfy people who had never once looked down and wonder how the floor beneath them stayed so warm. This job fell almost without exception to enslaved workers, men whose entire days were spent keeping a comfort alive that they themselves were never permitted to enjoy sitting in. There is something quietly devastating about that arrangement, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. The very warmth Amelia treasured, the warmth that made her afternoon feel like peace, existed only because someone else was enduring something close to the opposite of peace, one shovelful of wood at a time, close enough to hear the laughter overhead, and never once invited to join it. Let's move upstairs back toward the changing room, where Amelia first handed off her folded clothes, because there is another kind of worker waiting there too, one whose job existed for a very specific, very practical reason. Theft at Roman bathhouses was common enough that it shows up again and again in the writing left behind from this period. A schoolbook used to teach Roman children Greek and Latin includes a small scene of a boy leaving his belongings with a servant and warning him plainly not to fall asleep on account of the thieves. It is such an ordinary little detail tucked into a children's lesson, and yet it tells you everything about how routine this particular worry had become. We do not have to guess how seriously people took it, either because archaeologists have found something remarkable, preserved in the mud near a bathhouse in what is now the city of Bath in England, a place the Romans themselves called Aquisulis, named for a local goddess they blended together with their own Minerva. Visitors there sometimes wrote out curses, thin sheets of metal, scratched with a plea to the local goddess, folded up and thrown into the sacred spring, asking for justice against whoever had wronged them. Hundreds of these cursed tablets have survived, corroded and folded, pulled up out of the mud centuries later, by archaeologists who must have felt a small jolt of recognition reading them, since so many complain about exactly the kind of petty theft any of us might recognize immediately. One of these curses, remarkably specific, remarkably human, reads almost exactly like this. Someone has stolen my hooded cloak, and I am giving the thief over to the goddess. Whether that thief turns out to be a slave or a free person, whether man or woman, and that thief is not permitted to buy back my forgiveness, except with their own blood. Sit with that for a second. 2,000 years later, we can still feel exactly how furious that person was, standing at the edge of a sacred spring, practically shaking with the specific personal injustice of losing a warm cloak on what was probably a cold, miserable day. It is one of my favourite kinds of historical evidence, honestly, because it has nothing to do with emperors or armies or grand architecture. It is simply one ordinary aggravated person demanding blood over a stolen coat, and somehow that pettiness survives 2,000 years while entire dynasties fade into footnotes. To guard against exactly this kind of loss, wealthier Romans brought their own slaves along specifically to sit with their clothing while they bathed, and some bathhouses even offered a slave for hire on the spot called a capsarius, named after the small case used to carry belongings for anyone who had not brought their own. Watching over a stranger's folded toga for hours at a time in a hot, crowded room was somebody's entire job, day after day, and if a theft happened anyway, the consequences for that watcher could be severe indeed. Here is a detail about Roman bathhouse architecture that stopped me completely the first time I came across it, because it says something the marble and the mosaics never quite managed to say out loud on their own. Many of the grander bathhouses were built with 3 separate entrances, one for men, one for women, and one set apart entirely for the enslaved workers and attendants, who kept the entire operation running. The building's outer face was often perfectly symmetrical, carefully balanced on either side the way Roman architects loved to design almost everything a facade meant to project harmony and order to anyone passing by on the street. And yet tucked into that same balanced, orderly design sat a third door quieter, smaller, easy to overlook if you were not looking for it, sorting people by status before a single one of them had even stepped inside to undress. Even the front door of a building devoted to shared, communal relaxation was quietly divided along the exact same lines of status that shaped every other corner of Roman life. Equality, it turns out, stopped well short of the entrance embedded directly into the architecture itself, permanent and load-bearing long before anyone walking through it ever said a single word about who belonged where. Some of the wealthiest Romans took this even further, treating the number of slaves accompanying them to the baths almost like a walking advertisement of their own importance. One Roman historian describes especially wealthy citizens arriving with entourages as large as 50 people trailing behind them, carrying oils, towels, spare clothing, fanning their masters, announcing their arrival to anyone who had not already noticed the small crowd moving down the street. Being seen with an enormous retinue was in a very real sense the ancient version of arriving somewhere in an impressive car or wearing something unmistakably expensive, a visible, unmistakable signal of exactly where you sat in the social order broadcast without a single word needing to be spoken. Picture that scene for a moment dropping into the middle of Emilia's quiet, ordinary neighborhood Bath. 50 people moving as a single unit simply to help one person bathe. It would have been less like watching someone relax and more like watching a small parade pass through the courtyard. Can you imagine the sheer logistics of that? 50 separate individuals each with their own small task folded around one person's leisure time, and every single one of them still expected to appear invisible the moment their specific job was finished, fading quietly into the background the second their usefulness ended for the day. I think this is the part of tonight's story that deserves the most careful, honest attention, more than any of the strange substances or murky water we have already discussed, because everything we have admired so far tonight, the architecture, the ritual, the sense of shared civic life, rested directly on the labor of people who had no real choice in the matter at all. Enslaved workers did not get to decide whether they wanted to stoke a furnace in suffocating heat, or sit guarding a stranger's clothes for 6 hours straight, or trail behind a wealthy citizen carrying his towels like a walking piece of furniture. Their presence made the whole beautiful system function, and their presence is also the part most conveniently left out whenever we picture Rome purely through its marble columns and painted ceilings. I do not say this to make you feel guilty for enjoying the earlier parts of tonight's story, to be clear. I say it because I think a complete picture matters, and because the people who kept this system running deserve to be remembered as more than an invisible footnote to somebody else's relaxing afternoon. History has a long, uncomfortable habit of celebrating the finished product, while quietly erasing the hands that built it, and I would rather name that pattern directly than simply repeat it myself tonight without comment. Doesn't that pattern sound uncomfortably familiar once you start looking for it elsewhere? The comfortable convenience of a package arriving at your door the very next day, resting on labour most of us never see or think about, tucked into a warehouse somewhere far outside our own daily view. The quiet, unglamorous work of cleaning, cooking and caretaking that keeps entire households functioning, often carried out by people whose names we would struggle to remember if we ever learned them at all. Even the phrase we use casually today, working behind the scenes, carries a small echo of exactly this arrangement, a polite way of saying someone's effort matters enormously right up until the moment we stop needing to actually look at them. We have not entirely escaped this particular pattern. We have simply rearranged its edges, moved it further out of view, and gotten considerably better at not noticing it. Not every worker at the baths lived under quite the same conditions, though, and I think that distinction matters too, rather than flattening this into one single story. Some attendants were free citizens working for modest wages, hair pluckers and masseurs and vendors who moved through the crowd selling wine, sausages and pastries to hungry bathers between rounds of gossip and gambling, their voices calling out prices and offers over the general noise of the courtyard, each one hoping to be heard over the next. Their lives were considerably harder than Amelia's, closer to the edge of poverty than comfort, but they were at least in the eyes of Roman law free people, making their own choices about how to spend their days, even if those choices were narrowed considerably by circumstance and necessity. A free vendor could in theory walk away from a bad day, save a little money towards something better, pass a trade down to a child as an inheritance rather than a sentence. An enslaved furnace worker could do none of those things, no matter how skilled he became at his job, no matter how many years he spent perfecting the exact rhythm of feeding that fire. Slavery and free labor sat side by side in the very same courtyard, sometimes performing nearly identical tasks separated by a legal and social distinction that mattered enormously to the people living inside it, even when it might have looked from a distance like the exact same job. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of what we call luxury in any century quietly depends on layers of labor we have simply trained ourselves not to look at too closely. Rome built something remarkable with these bathhouses. It is also true and does not cancel out the first fact that this remarkable achievement rested on the backs of people history mostly forgot to name. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth bringing into the light before we move on, because it circles back in a strange way to money and to a question we have been quietly building toward through several parts of tonight's story already. If the wealthiest Romans could afford 50 attendants, private oil, imported perfume, and a household bath of their own for special occasions, did that money actually buy them anything close to real protection from everything we have discussed tonight? Or did even the most privileged, most heavily attended Roman in the city end up soaking in essentially the same invisible risk as everyone else, surrounded by 50 servants who could fetch anything except the one thing that actually mattered? So let's follow the story upward for a moment out of the furnace room and away from the crowded changing hall, past the vendors and the entrance doors sorted so carefully by status, toward the grandest, most expensive baths the empire ever built, palaces of leisure large enough to hold thousands of bathers at once, and ask a question that I think you already suspect the answer to. Picture for a moment leaving Amelia's modest neighborhood bath entirely behind, and walking instead toward a building so enormous it truly does not look real the first time you see even a scale model of it. Vaulted ceilings soaring higher than a modern 10-story building. Floors covered edge to edge in imported coloured marble shipped from quarries, scattered across 3 different continents. Gardens, libraries, lecture halls and gymnasiums all wrapped around a bathing complex so large that on a busy afternoon, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people might pass through its doors before the sun went down. 9,000 labourers spent more than 5 years building one of these complexes alone, and once finished, the furnaces beneath it were said to burn through something close to 10 tons of wood in a single day, just to keep the water at a comfortable temperature for whoever happened to walk through the door that morning. This is the world of the grand imperial thermi buildings like the ones an emperor named Caracalla and later an emperor named Diocletian built specifically to announce their own power in stone and steam. And if you are anything like me, your first instinct standing in front of a place like this is to assume that whatever we have spent tonight discussing the murky water, The shared sponge, the invisible risk hiding in plain sight must have worked differently here. Surely a building this magnificent, funded by an emperor with virtually unlimited resources, solved the problems a modest neighbourhood bath simply could not afford to fix. I want to test that assumption honestly with you tonight, the same way we have tested every other assumption across this whole story, because I think the answer surprised me more than almost anything else we have covered so far. It would be a tidy, comfortable place to end tonight's journey, wouldn't it, if the wealthy had simply engineered their way around the same risks everyone else was living with? It would let us close the story with a clean moral money solves problems and move on. But history rarely hands us endings quite that neat, and this particular question turned out to have a considerably more complicated answer waiting underneath it. Here is the detail that changes the whole picture immediately. These enormous imperial baths were not exclusive at all. They were free or close enough to free that cost was never really the barrier keeping anyone out. An emperor funding a building this expensive was not trying to create a private playground for Rome's wealthiest citizens. He was trying to win the love, loyalty and gratitude of the entire population all at once under one spectacular roof. It was politics dressed up as generosity, a marble billboard announcing that the emperor cared for every citizen equally regardless of what that citizen happened to own. So, on any given afternoon, that magnificent hall might hold a senator soaking a few feet away from a dock worker, a wealthy widow chatting near a shopkeeper's apprentice, everyone drawn together by the exact same free entry and the exact same shared water, regardless of how much money separated them everywhere else in their daily lives. Think about what that actually means for our question tonight. A bigger, grander building did not mean a more exclusive one. If anything, it meant more people, not fewer, funneling through the very same pools, the very same benches, the very same shared sponge we talked about earlier this evening, all in a single afternoon. Scale in this particular case did not buy separation. It simply meant a larger, more crowded version of exactly the same shared risk everyone else in the city was already living with. Now I know what some of you might be thinking, because it occurred to me too. Surely the wealthiest Romans, the ones with real fortunes, simply avoided the public crush entirely, and bathed at home instead. And it is true, some of them did exactly that. A private bath was without question a real luxury item, expensive to build, and even more expensive to keep heated, tucked into the grandest villas belonging to senators, successful merchants, and the occasional emperor's closest friends. A wealthy landowner might have his own small suite of heated rooms built onto the side of his country estate, complete with its own tiny furnace and its own dedicated staff to keep it running, purely for the use of his own household and whichever guests he chose to invite. If you had that kind of money, you really could soak in water nobody else's body had touched that day in a room nobody else was permitted to enter. But here is the detail worth sitting with. Even that private water drawn from the very same aqueducts feeding every public bath in the city travelled through the very same lead pipes we discussed earlier tonight, carried the very same dissolved minerals, and offered no actual protection at all from something nobody in this era could see or explain in the first place. Wealth could buy privacy. It could buy a smaller crowd or no crowd at all. What it could not buy, because the knowledge simply did not exist yet for anyone to purchase, was protection from a threat nobody had identified. You cannot spend your way around a danger you do not know is there, no matter how many rooms you own, or how many servants stand ready to fill your bath the moment you ask for it. And there is something else worth remembering here too, something we actually touched on a little earlier tonight without quite connecting it to this exact question. Even wealthy Romans who technically had a private bath waiting at home rarely used it exclusively. Remember why people went to the public baths in the first place. Business deals, political alliances, gossip news, and the simple pleasure of being seen among your peers. A senator hiding away in his own private pool, however luxurious, missed out on all of that entirely, and Roman social and political life was not something an ambitious person could afford to opt out of, no matter how much marble sat waiting for him at home. So even the wealthiest, best connected Romans in the city kept walking back through those public doors again and again, right alongside everyone else. Here is a story that I think settles this question about as definitively as ancient history ever settles anything. A little over a decade into the reign of a philosopher-emperor named Marcus Aurelius, a devastating illness swept across the entire Roman world, carried home, according to the accounts that survive, by soldiers returning from a military campaign in the east. Historians today generally believe it was smallpox based on descriptions of the fever and the distinctive skin eruptions that spread across a victim's entire body, though some researchers have argued for other possibilities over the years. It moved through the empire with a speed and a thoroughness that must have felt to anyone living through it almost apocalyptic. Reaching from military camps along the eastern frontier all the way to farming villages the soldiers themselves had never even heard of before the outbreak began. Some estimates suggest millions of people died over the years the outbreak lasted, cutting through cities, army camps, and rural villages alike, with reports of thousands of deaths recorded in the capital city alone on the very worst days. And here is the detail that answers our question tonight in a single sentence. This illness did not stop politely at the palace gates. Marcus Aurelius ruled alongside a co-emperor, a man named Lucius Verus, who almost certainly died from this very outbreak, collapsing during a journey and never fully recovering. Marcus Aurelius himself continued ruling for another decade, exhausted, grieving, and increasingly occupied with military crises along the empire's northern border, and by the time he finally passed away, some historians believe this same lingering epidemic may have played some part in his own decline as well. Two emperors, the absolute top of Roman society, surrounded by more resources, more physicians, and more private luxury than nearly anyone else alive at the time. And disease reached them anyway, exactly the way it reached a dock worker's family in a crowded apartment building, 3 streets from Amelia's own front door. We actually already know the physician who watched much of this unfold up close, because we met him earlier tonight in a very different context. Galen, the same young doctor who once treated gladiators in the arenas of Pergamon learning his trade, one horrifying wound at a time, was living and working in Rome by the time this outbreak tore through the city, having built a reputation impressive enough by then to attract wealthy patients, curious students, and eventually the attention of the emperor himself. He wrote detailed descriptions of the fever, the skin eruptions, and the exhausting, dangerous course of the illness, becoming one of our clearest surviving eyewitnesses to the whole disaster. According to some accounts, he even left the city for a time as the outbreak worsened, only to be summoned back directly by the emperors themselves, a request from that level of power being rather difficult for anyone, however famous or reluctant, to refuse. The very same careful, observant mind that once studied wounds carved open by a gladiator's sword was now watching an entire empire, emperors included, fall to something none of them could see coming, and none of them could stop once it arrived. Can you feel how that reframes everything we have discussed tonight? We have spent this whole evening imagining Amelia's small, ordinary risk one afternoon, one shared pool, one sponge passed quietly from stranger to stranger, and then sitting right alongside her in the historical record is proof that the very same vulnerability reached all the way to the top of the entire social pyramid, took a co-emperor's life, and quite possibly shortened the life of one of the most respected rulers Rome ever produced. I should be fair here too and resist the temptation to flatten this into something simpler than it actually was. Money did not prevent exposure, but it likely did shape survival odds, at least somewhat the way it still does during any major outbreak even today. A wealthy household could isolate a sick family member in a separate room, call on a private physician the moment symptoms appeared, and afford better food and rest during a long recovery. A family crowded into a small apartment above a noisy street had none of those advantages, and disease moves faster and often more lethally through exactly those conditions. So the honest, complete answer sits somewhere in between the two extremes. Wealth did not make anyone untouchable. It simply sometimes made the difference between a difficult illness and a fatal one, a distinction that mattered enormously to the people living through it, even if it never once mattered to the disease itself, which spread through palace and apartment block with equal indifferent efficiency. I think this is worth sitting with for a moment, honestly, because it cuts against something we like to believe about wealth and power in any century, not just this one. We tend to assume that enough money, enough status, enough private luxury eventually buys you out of the dangers ordinary people have to face. And sometimes in some very real ways it does. Money buys better food, cleaner water, when it is available doctors with more time to spend on you personally, a softer bed to recover in if illness does arrive. But it has never in any era bought complete immunity from the biological reality everyone shares, simply by being human, breathing the same air, drinking from the same rivers, standing eventually in the path of something science has not caught up to yet. Rome's own emperors are proof of that, written directly into the historical record for anyone willing to look closely enough to notice two of the most powerful men who ever lived, brought low by something too small for even their vast resources to see coming. Doesn't that reshape the whole story we've been telling tonight just slightly? This was never really a tale about poor hygiene among ordinary careless people, while the wealthy quietly stayed safe somewhere above it all. It was a story about an entire civilization, top to bottom, senator and dock worker emperor, and fuller sharing the exact same blind spot together. Because the blind spot itself had nothing to do with class, and everything to do with a piece of knowledge that simply had not been discovered yet by anyone rich or poor. We have watched this exact pattern repeat itself in our own lifetimes too, haven't we? Whenever a new illness emerges before science fully understands it, wealth buys a better hospital room. It has never yet bought a body that is somehow exempt from biology itself. There is one more twist to this whole story worth bringing into the light before we close in on the end of it, and it has less to do with ancient Rome itself and more to do with us, and the particular very human habit of remembering the past exactly the way we would prefer it to have happened. Because somewhere between the fall of this empire and tonight, an entire comforting myth about Roman cleanliness took root, and stayed rooted for a lot longer than the actual evidence ever really supported. So let's step back for a moment out of the marble halls and away from the emperors and ask an honest question about why so many of us grew up believing Rome was spotless in the first place, when the evidence sitting quietly in the ground the whole time was telling a very different story. Here is a question I want you to sit with honestly for a moment before I give you my own answer to it. Close your eyes if you are somewhere safe enough to do that, and picture ancient Rome. Really picture it. What do you see? I would be willing to guess it involves white marble, gleaming impossibly bright, under a clear blue sky, tall columns, maybe a toga or two, everything clean, orderly and dignified the way a museum postcard might show it to you. Perhaps a senator delivering a speech, an eagle standard held high, sunlight catching the edge of a fountain that never seems to run murky. Almost nobody picturing Rome for the first time imagines a shared sponge, a murky pool, or a curse tablet cursing a stolen cloak. Almost nobody pictures Emilia at all honestly, an ordinary woman with an ordinary afternoon quietly missing from the postcard entirely. That image did not arrive by accident. Somebody built it piece by piece long after the empire itself had fallen, and I think understanding who built it and why might be the most important thing we discuss together tonight. Let's travel forward a very long way from Emilia's world now, past the fall of the empire itself, past centuries of ruin, and rebuilding all the way to the 1800s, when a wave of European scholars, adventurers, and wealthy travellers first began digging seriously into the buried cities Rome had left behind. Places like Pompeii and Herculaneum frozen almost perfectly by volcanic ash. Centuries earlier offered something no other archaeological site in the world could quite match. An entire slice of daily Roman life preserved intact, waiting patiently underground for someone to finally lift the ash away and look. Bread still sitting in an oven, paintings still bright on a wall. It must have felt to the people uncovering it less like archaeology and more like stepping directly into another century still warm from the people who had lived there. And when these 19th century scholars did look, they found exactly what we have spent this whole evening exploring together. Latrines, graffiti, evidence of lice of disease, of ordinary, unglamorous daily struggle, sitting right alongside the beautiful mosaics and painted walls. But here is the detail worth sitting with. Many of these same scholars had spent their entire education, and often their entire careers, positioning themselves as the proud, intellectual heirs of Roman civilization. They saw themselves standing at the far end of a direct, unbroken line running back through the Renaissance, through classical learning, all the way to Rome itself, and they were quite understandably deeply invested in that line representing something noble, refined, and worth inheriting. A historian who has spent decades studying Roman sanitation, someone occasionally and rather wonderfully nicknamed the Queen of Latrines for her dedication to exactly this subject, has pointed out something sharp about this exact period of scholarship. I love that nickname, honestly, and I hope she wears it with pride because it takes a particular kind of patience and good humour to spend an entire academic career examining ancient toilets, while colleagues study emperors and battles and grand political intrigue instead. She's spent years working through cities like Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Ostia, piecing together graffiti paintings and old written accounts to build a truly honest picture of what daily Roman sanitation actually looked like, rather than the polished version everyone assumed for so long. 19th century academics wanted very badly to see themselves as the cultured, sophisticated descendants of Roman greatness. Digging too deeply into the grubby, complicated, occasionally disgusting reality of actual daily Roman life threatened that comfortable self-image. So a great deal of that evidence simply got quietly set aside, filed under footnotes. Nobody was in a hurry to publicize while the marble columns and dramatic mosaics took center stage in every museum display and every popular history book that followed. Can you feel how convenient that particular blind spot was? These were, after all, men writing the history books that would shape public understanding of Rome for generations afterward, men whose own universities, own architecture, and own sense of cultural superiority all leaned heavily on the idea that Rome represented civilization at its finest. If Rome was clean, disciplined, and sophisticated, then a 19th century European scholar modelling his own education architecture and even table manners on Roman example got to inherit all of that same clean, disciplined sophistication by association. If Rome was in reality crawling with lice soaking in murky communal water and quietly riddled with parasites its own engineering had somehow made worse that inheritance suddenly looked considerably less flattering to claim, and considerably harder to justify to anyone questioning why European culture deserved to sit at the top of any particular ladder at all. I do not think this was necessarily a deliberate, calculated cover-up, to be clear, and I want to be fair to these scholars, rather than simply painting them as villains in tonight's story. It was something quieter, and in a strange way more human than that. It is remarkably easy to overlook evidence that complicates a story you already love telling, especially when nobody around you is pushing back very hard, and especially when the version you prefer also happens to flatter you personally. We all do smaller versions of this constantly, don't we? Gently editing our own memories, our own family histories, even our own daily routines to fit a slightly more flattering narrative than the messier truth would actually support. Here is something that might make you smile though, because it turns out the actual evidence these scholars were quietly setting aside is often wonderfully, disarmingly funny once you stop expecting Roman history to be dignified at every turn. By the 4th century, the city of Rome alone had well over 100 public latrines scattered across its streets, and Pompeii smaller, as it was seen to have one tucked into nearly every shop and tavern in town. And Roman latrine walls, much like bathroom stalls today, were covered in graffiti scratched or painted by ordinary people passing through. One traveller, apparently stranded overnight in an unfamiliar inn, left behind a rather grumpy little note, complaining that he and his companion had been forced to wet the bed since nobody had thought to leave out a chamber pot. Another line, found exactly where you would expect to find it, simply reads that a doctor belonging to the Emperor Titus once had, and I will phrase this delicately, a particularly satisfying visit to that exact spot. Someone 2,000 years ago thought that detail was worth permanently carving into a wall, and somehow against every possible odd, we're still reading it together tonight, giggling slightly, the exact same way that original graffiti artists probably hoped a stranger someday would. Doesn't that tell you something wonderful about how little human nature has actually changed? Strip away the marble, the empire, the emperors, and you are left with people leaving behind exactly the kind of silly, petty, occasionally crude little jokes people still leave behind today, whether that is bathroom graffiti or an anonymous comment on the internet. The dignified, polished version of Rome we inherited quietly filtered almost all of that out because it did not fit the story 19th century scholars wanted to tell about who they were descended from. There is another layer to this myth worth mentioning too, one that has less to do with careful scholars and more to do with simple physics. Marble survives, sponges do not. A murky pool of water once drained leaves behind nothing but an empty basin, patiently waiting 2,000 years for a tourist to walk past and admire its clean, dry, perfectly preserved shape. Wood rots, cloth disintegrates, smell obviously leaves no trace at all, vanishing the moment the last person who noticed it stopped breathing. Stone the stone simply waits indifferent to time in a way almost nothing organic can match. The daily mess, the smell, the crowding, the actual lived experience of an ordinary afternoon at the baths simply could not survive the way the architecture around it did. We're left quite literally staring at the empty stage long after the entire messy, complicated performance is finished and walked off into history, and mistaking the silence for evidence that nothing untidy ever happened there at all. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how much of what any of us believe about the past is really just whatever happened to be built out of stone rather than flesh, ink, or memory. The buildings outlive the smell, the statues outlive the gossip, and centuries later we mistake the surviving stage set for the entire show, filling in the missing messier parts with whatever version feels most comfortable to imagine instead. And honestly, this pattern did not stop with 19th century scholars either. Walk into nearly any film or television show set in ancient Rome, and you will notice the exact same polished aesthetic quietly repeating itself. Gleaming white columns, even though we now know most Roman buildings were originally painted in loud, vivid colour, not the pale white we associate with them today. Pristine togas, spotless within seconds of the opening scene. Bath water so clear you could read a scroll through it. It looks stunning on screen, and I understand completely why filmmakers reach for that image again and again, since audiences generally show up wanting grandeur, not gangrene. But every single time that image gets repeated, the more honest, more complicated version we've spent this whole evening uncovering together gets pushed just a little further out of view, buried under one more layer of comfortable, familiar polish, generation after generation, until the myth starts to feel less like a myth and more like simple, settled fact. I want to be careful here, because I am not telling you tonight that Rome deserves to be remembered only for its filth, any more than it deserves to be remembered only for its marble. Both things were completely true at the very same time, in the very same buildings, often in the very same hour. Emilia truly experienced beauty, warmth, and community in that pool this afternoon. The laughter was real. The friendship with Flavia was real. The warmth soaking into tired shoulders after a long day was every bit as real as anything else in her life. She also unknowingly experienced real risk sitting in water. Her own doctors were slowly, imperfectly starting to understand might not be quite as safe as it looked. Neither half of that story cancels the other one out. A complete picture of the past holds both truths at once, without needing to flatten either one down for the sake of a tidier narrative, the same way a complete picture of almost anything in life usually requires holding two seemingly contradictory things gently side by side rather than forcing one of them to disappear. I think that is really the whole lesson sitting underneath everything we have walked through together tonight. History rarely arrives to us as a complete honest account. It arrives filtered, sorted, and occasionally polished by whoever happened to be doing the recording, the digging, or the storytelling, each one of them carrying their own quiet reasons for shaping the story exactly the way they eventually told it. A conquering general writes the history flattering to conquerors. A proud scholar writes the history flattering to scholars. And a storyteller sitting somewhere quiet at the end of a long day telling you about it centuries later still has to make choices about which details to include and which to leave for another night. None of us are entirely free of that filter, myself included. The best any of us can do is stay honest about the fact that a filter exists at all, rather than pretending the version we happen to be looking at is the whole unedited truth. Our job as the people receiving that story generations later is not to simply accept the shiniest version, because it happens to be the version that survived loudest. Our job is to go looking gently and honestly for the parts that got quietly left out along the way, the sponges instead of just the statues, the graffiti instead of just the inscriptions, the ordinary Tuesday afternoons instead of just the triumphant parades. We're almost at the end of our evening together now, and I think it is worth asking one final question before we let this particular story rest completely. If an entire empire brilliant enough to build aqueducts stretching for miles could still misunderstand something as fundamental as its own water, and if generations of scholars afterward could still misunderstand the empire itself, what does that combination actually leave behind for us? 2,000 years later, still lying awake thinking about a bathhouse in a city that stopped breathing centuries ago. Maybe it leaves us with something more valuable than either the marble or the mess alone could offer. A reminder that certainty in any century deserves a little gentle suspicion, and that the most interesting version of any story is usually the one somebody at some point quietly tried to leave out. So let's bring this whole journey home together one last time, and see what Rome, filth and marble both still has left to teach us before we finally close our eyes tonight, and what became in the end of an empire that built something remarkable, misunderstood it completely, and still somehow managed to leave the world just a little better than it found it. Let's go back one final time to that ordinary Tuesday we've been quietly following all evening. Amelia is home now, the lamp burning low, the sound of the street outside finally settling into something closer to quiet. Her bathing kit sits by the door where she left it hours ago, the little flask of oil almost empty, the bronze scraper cooling on the table beside a half-eaten piece of bread. Somewhere below, a neighbour's voice hums a few tired notes of a song, the same low, unhurried melody drifting up through the floorboards that seems to follow this whole city everywhere it goes, day fading gently into evening, the way it always does, the way it always has. She has no idea, of course, that any of this will matter to anyone, ever, let alone to a stranger sitting somewhere 2,000 years in the future, listening to her whole afternoon unfold like a bedtime story. To her today was simply today. A bath, a friend, a few coins spent on laundry, an early evening at home before sleep. Nothing more dramatic than that, and honestly nothing less important either. I think that is worth holding on to as we close this particular chapter together, because everything we have discussed tonight, the murky water, the shared sponge, the invisible parasites hiding in a beautiful pool, all of it happened inside the most ordinary kind of day imaginable. Not a battle, not a coronation. Just an afternoon repeated with small variations by millions of people across hundreds of years, all across an empire that stretched further than most of those people could have even conceived of on a map. History books love to organize the past around dramatic dates and decisive moments, and rightly so in their own way. But so much of what actually shaped ordinary Roman lives happened quietly, repeatedly, invisibly, in exactly the kind of afternoon we've spent tonight walking through. Together, an afternoon that never once made it into any official record, remembered only because we chose together to imagine it back into existence, and that more than any single gross detail we have covered might be the real lesson, sitting quietly underneath tonight's entire story. Rome did not fall because of dirty bath water. Rome did not rise because of it either. The empire's whole complicated relationship with cleanliness simply lived day after day inside the background hum of ordinary life, the way most of history actually happens, not in dramatic turning points, but in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small repeated choices nobody thought twice about making. Think back for a moment across everything we have walked through together tonight. A pool that looked flawless and carried real risk underneath its surface. A sponge meant to help quietly capable of harm. A substance considered so valuable an emperor built an entire tax around it, while a stubborn myth about how it was used somehow outlived the truth by centuries. Physicians who noticed real patterns without ever having the language to fully explain them, working right alongside physicians who still believed in curing epilepsy with a dead man's blood. An architecture of leisure that quietly divided people by status even at the front door, while somehow still managing to be one of the more truly democratic public spaces the ancient world ever built. Emperors who could build a wall across an entire country, yet could not convince their own citizens to bathe according to a schedule. And finally, scholars 2,000 years later, so eager to see themselves reflected in Rome's marble that they quietly looked away from everything sitting in its drains. None of these threads exist in isolation if you step back far enough to see the whole shape of the story. They are all really the same idea told from a dozen different angles, echoing back and forth across the whole evening. Human beings build remarkable things, believe deeply in their own solutions, and then discover, sometimes gently and sometimes not so gently, that understanding a problem and actually solving it are two very different accomplishments. Rome had incredible engineering. What it did not have and could not have had yet was the science to fully understand what that engineering was actually doing moment to moment to the people trusting it with their health. If tonight's story leaves you with one single thought to carry into sleep, let it be that one simple and quiet as it is. Progress and understanding do not always arrive together, no matter how convincing the marble looks. I do not think that makes Rome foolish, and I hope if nothing else survives from tonight's story, that particular point does. It makes Rome human in the most complete sense of that word. Brilliant and blind at the very same time, the way every civilization before and after it has managed to be, including, I suspect, our own, in ways we will only fully understand a few centuries from now, once someone else is sitting somewhere warm, telling our story the way we have told Amelia's tonight. We build our own version of the aqueduct every single day in every field of knowledge we currently trust, completely confident that we have finally figured something out, only for a future generation to gently, patiently point out exactly where our own blind spot was hiding the whole time. That is not a failure unique to Rome. That is simply what it means to be a species still learning one imperfect discovery at a time across every century we have ever lived through. Here is something gentle. I want to leave you with something a little softer than parasites and curse tablets, before we let this evening finally rest. Somewhere in that quiet Roman apartment lamp flickering low, Amelia is almost certainly thinking about nothing more complicated than what to make for dinner tomorrow, or whether Flavia's joke about the neighbour was actually as funny as it felt in the moment, or the small comfortable relief of finally sitting down after a long day. Maybe her feet ache a little, the good satisfied kind of ache that comes from a full afternoon spent on them. Maybe she's already half asleep, sitting upright the way any of us might be, right now listening to this very sentence. She lived a full, ordinary, entirely human life, exactly the kind most of us are living right now, filled with small pleasures and small worries, largely unaware of the enormous complicated systems quietly humming along underneath the surface of her everyday choices. In that particular way, 2,000 years apart, she's really not so different from you, tucked wherever you are tonight. Half asleep, listening to a stranger's voice describe a city that stopped breathing centuries before your own began. That, I think, is the quiet, comforting thread running underneath every single story I get to bring you here. Not just the facts, the dates, the strange and startling details, though. I hope you've enjoyed plenty of those tonight. But the reminder that history is not really about emperors and armies, not at its core. It is about ordinary people living ordinary days, making ordinary choices with the limited knowledge available to them at the time, exactly the way we're all doing right now, tonight, in our own small, unremarkable, quietly remarkable lives. I want to say something honest before we close for the night. Putting a story like this together takes a considerable amount of care, more than you might expect from the outside. Real research, real sources, real attempts to separate what history actually shows us from what popular myth simply repeats often enough to feel true. Hours spent chasing down a single detail, checking whether a claim about gladiators or urine or a stolen cloak actually holds up against what historians themselves can verify. Because you deserve a story that respects both your time and your curiosity, not just the loudest, most exaggerated version of the truth. If tonight's journey through ancient Rome kept you good company, whether you listened to the whole thing or drifted off somewhere along the way, that means more to me than you probably realize. If you found yourself curious or surprised, or maybe smiling at a stubborn poet's insult surviving 2,000 years, just to make you laugh tonight, a like on this video, a comment sharing your favorite detail, or a subscribe for the next quiet evening we spend together would mean the world to me. It costs you nothing, and it helps this little corner of the internet keep telling these stories carefully, honestly, one strange and human detail at a time. Every single one of those small gestures tells me the effort behind an evening like this one was worth it, and honestly, on a quiet night when it is just you, me, and 2,000 years of history between us, that feels like a truly lovely thing to know. And there are so many more evenings like this one waiting ahead of us. So many more ordinary people tucked into the corners of extraordinary empires whose stories deserve exactly this kind of gentle, careful attention. Other cities older than Rome and younger than it too. Other centuries, some brighter, some considerably darker. Other quiet, unremarkable Tuesdays that turned out centuries later to hold something worth telling, waiting patiently in an archive somewhere, or buried under a hillside nobody has thought to dig into just yet. I already have a few of those evenings in mind, honestly tucked away, and waiting for the right night to bring them to you properly, the same careful way we brought you Amelia's story tonight. I hope you will come back and find me again whenever you need somewhere calm to land at the end of your own long day, whenever curiosity feels more inviting than scrolling, whenever you simply want good company while your mind finally starts to slow down. Whatever brought you here tonight, a bad day, a sleepless night, plain curiosity about a very strange bathhouse, or simply the habit of falling asleep to a familiar voice, I am glad it brought you here, and I would be glad to have it bring you back again too. For now though, let's let Amelia rest. Let the lamp burn down the rest of the way on its own, the flame shrinking slowly until only a faint orange glow remains against the wall. Let the last voices outside fade into silence one by one, a door closing somewhere down the street, a cart rattling off toward home, the city easing itself street by street into the particular hush that settles over every city in every century, once the day has finally finished asking anything more of anyone. Let that whole warm, complicated, imperfect city settle quietly into the dark, the way it has settled every single night for 2,000 years, marble and messed together exactly as it always was, exactly as it always will be somewhere just underneath the ground you're standing on right now, if you happen to be anywhere near the Mediterranean tonight, and somewhere gently present in your imagination if you're not. And let yourself rest too right where you are. Whatever today asked of you, whatever tomorrow is still waiting to ask, none of it needs solving in this exact moment. You can simply lie here a while longer, warm and unhurried the way Amelia once did, letting your thoughts drift, the way steam drifts through an old stone room, soft and slow, and going nowhere in particular. There is nothing left to figure out tonight, no decision waiting to be made, no task waiting to be finished, no version of yourself you need to be right now, other than exactly comfortably who you already are, settled into whatever quiet corner of the world you have found for yourself this evening. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders soften, let the last of tonight's story settle over you the way warm water once settled over a tired woman in a city that no longer stands 2,000 years and one very long, very human story away from where you are lying right now. Thank you for spending this long, strange, oddly tender evening with me, walking through pools and sponges and cursed tablets and emperors, all the way down to one ordinary woman falling asleep in a city that no longer exists. Thank you for staying curious even when the details turned strange, and for staying kind about a civilization that, like every civilization including our own, got some things brilliantly right and other things quietly wrong. I am deeply grateful you chose to spend that time here. Of all the places you could have been tonight, of all the videos, all the noise, all the endless scrolling waiting just one tap away, you chose this instead, a slow walk through an ordinary Roman afternoon, and I do not take that choice for granted. Rest well. Sleep deeply. Let tonight's story settle quietly into the back of your mind the way all the best stories do, ready to surface again someday, when you least expect it. Maybe the next time you step into a warm bath of your own and think just for a moment about a woman named Amelia and the water she once trusted completely. And I will be here quietly waiting with another story whenever you're ready to wander back this way again. Good night.